Imagine a world before flight, before radar, before radio waves crossed the oceans. A world where the sky belonged only to birds and clouds and the occasional hot air balloon, tethered to the earth by rope and hope. The year was 1897. The Wright brothers were still running a bicycle shop. Powered flight was a fantasy confined to the sketches of dreamers and the pages of Jules Verne novels. And yet, something was flying. Not drifting, flying, with purpose, with control, against the wind. This is not legend. This is not folklore passed down through generations until truth became myth. This is documented history. Tens of thousands of Americans reported seeing massive objects in the sky during the spring of 1897. Newspapers across the Midwest and beyond printed eyewitness accounts. Telegraph operators relayed messages from town to town, each one describing the same impossible thing. They called it the mystery airship. What follows is the account of one man who didn't just see it, he spoke to it. Or rather, it spoke to him. His name was Thomas Kellerman, and in April of 1897, he was a telegraph operator in a small city that no longer appears on most maps. He wrote this account in 1932, 3 years before his death, and it was discovered in a trunk in his daughter's attic in 1978. This is his story. Chapter 1. The night the wires went silent. I had been working the late shift at the Western Union office on Meridian Street for nearly 6 years when it happened. April 14th, 1897. A Tuesday. The kind of night where the air feels heavy even though no rain is coming. The kind of night where dogs pace and horses stamp in their stables for no reason anyone can name. The office was quiet. It usually was after 9 in the evening. Most messages had been sent. Most businesses had closed. I sat at my desk with the telegraph key in front of me, the familiar brass instrument that connected our small city to the rest of the civilized world. In those days, before telephones were common, before radio existed even as a concept, the telegraph was everything. It was how news travelled, how money moved, how the world spoke to itself. I was transcribing a message from Chicago when every line went dead at once, not flickering, not fading, dead. The silence was absolute. In 6 years of operating that key, I had never experienced anything like it. Telegraph lines fail, certainly. Storms knock them down. Animals chew through insulation. Poles fall. But it happens gradually, one line at a time. One city losing connection, while others remain. This was different. Every single line to every city we connected with went silent in the same instant. I checked the connections, I tested the battery, I tapped the key repeatedly, sending out calls that went nowhere. Nothing. The lines were physically intact as far as I could tell from inside the office, but they carried nothing. No hum, no static, just dead air. I noted the time, 9:42 in the evening. I sat there in the lamplight, waiting, because there was nothing else to do. The office felt strange in the silence. Normally there was always some background noise, the faint clicking of distant keys, the subtle vibration of signals passing through the wires even when they weren't intended for us. But now there was nothing. It felt like the entire country had stopped breathing. The silence lasted exactly 9 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the wall, counting every second, wondering if something catastrophic had happened, if somehow the entire telegraph network had been destroyed in some unimaginable disaster. And then at 9:51, every line came back online simultaneously. The key began clicking immediately. Message after message flooded in, all marked urgent, all from different cities within a 100-mile radius. I pulled the tape as it printed, reading the words as they appeared. From Fort Wayne, large object in sky moving south, glowing, silent, not a balloon. from Lafayette. Airship sighted over Courthouse. Impossible size, controlled movement from Muncie. Strange craft overhead, lights along hull, moving against wind, no sound. From Anderson. Cigar-shaped vessel in sky, multiple witnesses, telegraph interference reported. They kept coming. Every town, every operator, all reporting the same thing within the same 9-minute window when our lines had been dead. Something was in the sky, something large, something that moved with intention, and something that had interfered with every telegraph line in the region at exactly the same time. I stood up from my desk, my hands shaking slightly as I held the printed tape. The messages were still coming in, variations on the same theme. I walked to the front window of the office and looked out onto Meridian Street. A few people were outside, standing in small groups, pointing upward. I opened the door and stepped into the cool night air. That's when I saw it. Chapter 2. The Shape. No one could explain it, hung in the sky about 1,000 feet up, maybe less. Distance is hard to judge when you have no reference for the object's size, but it was large, enormously large. Perhaps 200 feet long, shaped like a cigar or a massive elongated egg. The surface appeared dark, almost black, but along the underside ran a series of small lights, maybe 20 or 30 of them, evenly spaced, glowing with a soft yellow-white colour. It moved slowly from north to south, directly over the centre of town. I need you to understand what I'm describing. This was 1897. There were no airplanes. The Zeppelin would not be invented for another 3 years. Balloons existed, certainly, but they were at the mercy of wind, round and clumsy, and incapable of the controlled movement I was witnessing. This object moved deliberately. When the wind blew, from the east the object continued south. When the wind shifted northwest, the object maintained its course. It was not drifting, it was flying, and it was silent. No engine noise, no propeller sound, nothing. Just the faint whisper of wind around its hull, like the sound of a ship cutting through water. But softer, almost gentle. Several people on the street stood frozen, their faces tilted upward, mouths slightly open. I recognised the bank manager, the owner of the general store, a schoolteacher whose name I forget. Normal people having an abnormal experience. Someone said, "What in God's name is that?" No one answered because no one had an answer. I watched as the object passed directly overhead. The lights on its underside pulsed very slightly, not rhythmically, like a heartbeat, but irregularly, as if responding to some internal process I couldn't understand. The hull itself seemed smooth, almost seamless, without the rivets or panels you would expect on any human-made construction. It looked poured rather than built, organic in a way that metal should not be. A young boy, maybe 12 years old, stood near me on the sidewalk. He asked his father, "Is it from the government?" His father, a blacksmith with hands like hammers, shook his head slowly. "Government doesn't have anything like that, son. Nobody does." The object was moving toward the southern edge of town now, descending slightly as it went. I could see it more clearly as it lowered. There were features I hadn't noticed before, what looked like small protrusions along the sides, perhaps observation ports or windows, though they emitted no light. A subtle taper at the front, like the bow of a ship designed to cut through air instead of water, and at the rear, a series of thin structures that might have been fins or stabilizers. It passed over the last row of buildings and continued toward the open farmland beyond. As it moved, I realized it was heading directly toward the railroad yard, a flat open area where freight cars sat waiting for morning. I made a decision in that moment that would change everything. I went back inside the office, grabbed my coat and hat, and locked the door behind me. Then I followed the airship. Chapter 3. The City Watches. By the time I reached the edge of town, at least 50 people had gathered. Word spreads fast in a small city, especially when something impossible appears in the sky. The crowd stood at the boundary, between the last street and the open land, watching as the airship descended slowly toward the rail yard about half a mile distant. The local newspaper editor, a man named Robert Marsh, was there with a notebook, scribbling frantically by the light of a handheld lantern. He looked at me as I approached. "Kellerman," he said, "your telegraph's still working." "It's working now," I replied. "Went dead for 9 minutes right before this thing appeared. Every line in the region reported the same." He wrote that down, his pencil moving rapidly across the page. "Multiple towns reporting sightings. I already confirmed at least 8 within 50 miles, all describing the same object. This is going to be front page across the country." A woman in the crowd, elderly and sharp-eyed, said loudly, "It's a sign, end times. The Bible speaks of vessels descending from heaven." A younger man countered, "It's Edison or Tesla. Has to be. Some kind of electric airship they've been testing in secret." Someone else, "Could be European. Germans have been working on dirigibles." But we all knew those explanations didn't fit. This thing moved too smoothly, too quietly, with too much control. And the timing, the simultaneous telegraph interference, the coordinated sightings across multiple cities, none of it aligned with any human technology we knew. The airship had stopped descending and now hovered about 30 feet above the rail yard. The lights along its underside grew slightly brighter, casting pale circles of illumination on the ground below. The crowd grew quieter, sensing something was about to happen. I felt it too, a pressure in the air, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Then the lights on the airship began to pulse in a pattern, not random, deliberate, a sequence, long pulses and short pulses with precise intervals between them. I recognized the rhythm immediately. It was Morse code, or something very close to it. I pulled a small notebook from my pocket, the one I always carried for recording messages, and began writing down the sequence. Long, short, short, long, long, short, short, long, long. It repeated 3 times, then stopped. I stared at the pattern, trying to decode it, but it didn't match any standard Morse sequences I knew. The intervals were wrong. The groupings were unfamiliar. Robert Marsh leaned over my shoulder. "What does it say?" "I don't know," I admitted. "It's structured like code, but it's not any code I recognize." The airship began moving again, drifting slowly eastward, away from the town and the crowd. Some people started to follow, walking across the open field, but most remained where they were, uncertain and afraid. I stood there with my notebook, watching the lights fade into the distance, and felt a strange certainty settle over me. This wasn't observation. This was communication, and it was directed at me. Chapter 4. The Interference. I returned to the telegraph office just after midnight. The streets were still busy with people discussing what they had seen. Groups gathered under street lamps, voices excited and nervous. I unlocked the door and went inside, lighting the lamp on my desk. The office felt different now, charged somehow, as if the air itself had been altered by what had happened. The telegraph key sat silent on the desk. I sat down in my chair and stared at it, thinking about the pattern of lights I had seen on the airship, the way they pulsed in structured sequences. I opened my notebook and looked at what I had written. Long, short, short. Long, long, short. Short, long, long. Then the key began clicking on its own. My hand was nowhere near it. The key depressed and released, tapping out a rhythm that made the brass lever bounce and the sounder clack. I watched, frozen, as the tape began feeding through the register, recording whatever signal was coming through the wire. But there was no signal. I could see that the line indicator showed no activity. The battery was disconnected. The key should not have been moving at all. It clicked for perhaps 30 seconds, printing a line of marks on the tape that made no sense in Morse code. Then it stopped. The office fell silent again. I pulled the tape free and held it up to the lamplight, studying the pattern. It was similar to what I had seen on the airship, but more complex, more detailed. There were subtle variations in the spacing, slight differences in the length of the marks that suggested layers of meaning I couldn't access. I set the tape down on the desk and looked out the window. The airship was no longer visible in the sky, but I had the unmistakable feeling that it was still close, still watching. The pressure in my head returned. That same sensation I had felt when the lights had pulsed in the rail yard. Not painful, but present, like someone standing just behind you in an empty room. I reached out and placed my fingers on the telegraph key. I began tapping out a simple message in standard Morse code. "Who are you?" The moment I finished, the key stopped vibrating under my hand. The pressure in my head intensified briefly, then vanished. I sat there in the silence, waiting for a response, but nothing came. I tried again. "What do you want?" Still nothing. Then I realized my mistake. I was using human language, human symbols. Whatever was on the other end of this communication understood structure and pattern, but not necessarily our specific codes. I needed to respond in the same way it had contacted me. I looked at the sequence on the tape, the pattern it had sent. I began tapping it back on the key, reproducing the rhythm as accurately as I could. Long, short, short. Long, long, short. Short, long, long. I repeated it 3 times, exactly as the airship's lights had done. The key went still under my fingers. And outside, barely visible through the window, the airship descended from the clouds directly above Meridian Street. It hung there, motionless, the lights on its underside glowing bright enough now to cast shadows on the street below. I stood up slowly, my heart hammering in my chest, and walked to the door. I opened it and stepped outside. The airship lowered until it hovered just above the roof line of the buildings. I could see details now that had been invisible from a distance. The hull was not metal, or if it was metal, it was unlike any I had ever seen. It had a faint iridescence, like oil on water, shifting subtly in colour as the light moved across it. The small protrusions I had noticed earlier were definitely ports of some kind, circular openings rimmed with a darker material. And then, with no sound at all, the airship began to move again. It drifted southward, slowly, deliberately, and I understood that it wanted me to follow. I grabbed my coat and hat from inside the office, locked the door, and began walking. Several people on the street watched me go, watched the airship drifting ahead of me, but no one else followed. Perhaps they were too afraid, perhaps they were smarter than I was. I followed the airship out of town, toward the rail yard, toward whatever waited there. Chapter 5. The Descent. The rail yard was deserted at that hour. Freight cars sat in silent rows, their shadows long under the moonlight. The airship descended slowly into the centre of the open area, its lights illuminating the dirt and gravel below. I approached carefully, staying about 100 feet back, watching as the massive object lowered itself to the ground with impossible gentleness. It touched down without impact, settling onto the earth as lightly as a feather. The lights along the underside dimmed slightly, but did not go out. I could hear it now, a very faint humming, so low it was almost below the threshold of hearing. Not mechanical, more like a vibration, a frequency felt as much as heard. 2 other men, had followed me from town, though I hadn't noticed them until now. One was Robert Marsh, the newspaper editor, still clutching his notebook. The other was a farmer named William Hayes, a practical man not given to flights of fancy. We stood together at the edge of the rail yard, 3 witnesses to something none of us could explain. The airship sat there for perhaps 5 minutes, humming softly, its lights pulsing in that strange irregular rhythm. Then, with a sound like air escaping from a sealed container, a section of the hull opened. Not a door swinging on hinges. The surface simply separated, creating an opening about 6 feet tall and 3 feet wide. No light came from inside, only darkness, and then a figure stepped out. Chapter 6. The Occupant. It was humanoid. That was the first thing I noticed. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, a torso, proportioned similarly to a human being, but not quite right. Too tall, perhaps 7 feet. Too thin, the limbs longer than they should be. It wore some kind of tight-fitting garment that covered everything except the head and hands. A material that looked almost liquid in the moonlight, dark blue or black, seamless. The head was the most unsettling feature, pale, hairless, with large eyes that caught the light and reflected it back with a faint golden sheen. The nose was small, almost vestigial. The mouth was a thin line, barely visible. The overall impression was not monstrous exactly, but profoundly other. This was not a human being in a costume. This was something else. It stood at the opening of the airship, motionless, and turned its head slowly to look at each of us in turn. When its eyes met mine, I felt that pressure in my head again. Stronger now, almost overwhelming. Not painful, but intrusive, as if something was pushing gently against the inside of my skull. I tried to step back but found I couldn't move. My feet seemed rooted to the ground. The figure stepped forward, moving with a strange gliding motion that made it hard to tell if it was walking or floating. It approached us slowly, stopping about 20 feet away. Robert Marsh made a small choking sound and dropped his notebook. William Hayes stood rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. I remained still, unable to move, locked in place by whatever force was emanating from this being. And then it spoke. Or rather, it communicated. There was no sound, no words, but meaning flooded into my mind with absolute clarity. Not language, concepts, images, understanding delivered directly, bypassing the need for translation. I saw maps, not maps of land, but maps of connection. Lines crisscrossing continents, nodes where the lines intersected, pulses of light moving along the paths. I saw cities connected by invisible threads, messages flowing between them at the speed of lightning. I saw the telegraph network, not as wires and poles and keys, but as humanity's first attempt at creating a nervous system, a way for the species to communicate across distance instantly. And I understood that this was what interested them. Not our cities, not our wars, not our religions or governments or art, our communication networks. The moment when we stopped being isolated communities and started becoming something connected, something that could speak to itself across vast distances. The pressure in my head increased and more images came. I saw the airship, not as a single vessel, but as one of many, positioned across the continent, observing, recording. I saw them hovering over telegraph stations, following the lines, mapping the network. They were studying the infrastructure of human communication, the way a naturalist might study the veins in a leaf. And then I saw something else, a flash of the future, though I didn't understand it at the time. I saw towers transmitting invisible waves through the air. I saw voices carried without wires. I saw light pulsing in patterns that conveyed thought and image and sound simultaneously. I saw the world covered in a web of signals so dense that no point on Earth was isolated. Everything connected, everything speaking. They were interested in the beginning of that process, the moment we became detectable. The figure tilted its head slightly, and I felt a question forming in my mind. Not words, but the sense of inquiry. It wanted to know if I understood. I tried to form a response, to think clearly and deliberately. Yes, I understand. The pressure released immediately. The figure stepped back, its large eyes still fixed on me, and then turned smoothly and walked back to the airship. It paused at the opening, looked back once more, and then disappeared inside. The hull sealed itself with that same soft hissing sound. I could move again. I staggered slightly, catching my balance, and looked at Robert and William. They both appeared shaken, pale in the moonlight. Robert picked up his notebook with trembling hands. "Did you?" he started, then stopped. "Did you see?" "Yes," I said quietly. "I saw." The airship began to rise. Chapter 7. The Message. It lifted slowly, without sound, without fire or steam, or any visible means of propulsion. The lights along the underside grew brighter as it ascended, casting long shadows across the rail yard. We watched it climb until it was several hundred feet up, then turned smoothly and begin moving northward, back toward the centre of town. I ran, I don't know why. Instinct, perhaps, the sense that something important was about to happen, and I needed to be at the Telegraph office when it did. Robert and William followed, the three of us running through the dark streets as the airship drifted overhead. By the time we reached Meridian Street, people were emerging from their homes again, pointing at the sky, calling to each other. I unlocked the office and rushed inside, Robert and William close behind. I lit the lamp and sat down at the telegraph desk just as the key began clicking again. This time it was different. This time it was deliberate, controlled, sending a specific pattern. The tape fed through the register, recording the marks as they appeared. The sequence was complex, far more intricate than anything I had seen before. It went on for nearly 2 minutes, the key clicking steadily, the tape spooling out onto the desk, and then it stopped. The airship, visible through the window, rose straight up at tremendous speed and vanished into the clouds in seconds. The lights faded. The humming ceased. It was gone. I pulled the tape free and spread it out on the desk. Robert leaned over my shoulder, his breath still coming in short gasps from the run. William stood by the window, watching the empty sky. I studied the pattern, trying to make sense of it, but it was beyond my understanding. The sequences were too complex, the variations too subtle. It looked almost mathematical, like some kind of formula or equation rendered in dots and dashes. "What does it mean?" Robert asked. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I think it's important." I folded the tape carefully and put it in my pocket. The three of us sat there in silence for a long time, processing what we had witnessed. Eventually, Robert spoke. "I have to write this story. People need to know." "They won't believe you," William said quietly. "They'll say you're mad." "Maybe," Robert replied, "but I still have to try." He left shortly after, and William followed. I remained in the office, sitting at the desk, thinking about the maps I'd seen, the networks of light, the future, that had been shown to me. I thought about the being that had communicated with me, the way it had looked at me with those large golden eyes, and I wondered what it had seen when it looked back. The telegraph lines remained quiet for the rest of the night. No more strange signals, no more interference, just the normal flow of messages between cities, the routine communication that kept the country connected. But I knew that nothing was routine anymore. Something had noticed us. Something had come to observe the moment when humanity learned to speak across distance, and they had left me a message I couldn't understand. Not yet. Chapter 8. The Departure. The next morning, the story spread like wildfire. Robert Marsh published his account in the newspaper, describing the airship in detail, naming me and William as witnesses. Other papers picked up the story. Within days, it was being reported across the country. Thousands of people came forward with their own sightings, describing similar objects in skies from Texas to Michigan, from California to New York. But the narrative began to change almost immediately. Editors started adding qualifying language. Alleged airship, reported sighting, mass hysteria. Scientists weighed in, offering explanations. Venus seen through atmospheric distortion, ball lightning, experimental balloons from secret government projects. The explanations multiplied, each one more confident than the last, each one ignoring the specific details that made the sightings impossible to dismiss. Robert Marsh came under significant pressure. His editor at the paper demanded he retract the story, calling it irresponsible journalism. Local officials questioned him, suggesting he had fabricated the account for attention. Within 2 weeks, a follow-up article appeared in the paper, written by Robert but clearly edited heavily, stating that upon further reflection, he believed the object had been a misidentified balloon and that the late hour and unusual circumstances had led to mistaken observations. He came to see me at the Telegraph office the night that article was published. He looked exhausted, defeated. "I'm sorry," he said. "They didn't give me a choice. It was retract or lose my position." "I understand," I told him. "Did I do the right thing?" he asked. "Should I have fought harder?" I thought about the being I had seen, the message I had received, the future I had glimpsed. "You did what you had to do to survive," I said. "That's all any of us can do." He nodded slowly and left. I never spoke to him about it again. William Hayes stopped coming into town, retreating to his farm, refusing to discuss what he had seen. I was questioned by government officials, men in dark suits who arrived from Washington and asked the same questions over and over, their faces impassive, their voices flat. They wanted to know what I had seen, what had been communicated, whether I had the Telegraph tape. I told them everything except that last part. I described the airship, the being, the images in my mind. But I said nothing about the final message, the pattern that had been sent to my telegraph key. That tape remained in my pocket and later hidden in a metal box in my home. The officials eventually left, seemingly satisfied that I had nothing useful to offer. The sightings continued for another month, then gradually stopped. By summer, the airship wave had faded from public consciousness, dismissed as a curious episode of mass delusion. Life returned to normal. The telegraph lines carried their routine messages. The country moved forward, unaware that it had been observed at a crucial moment in its development. But I knew, and I kept the tape, waiting for the day when I might understand what it meant. Chapter 9. The Aftermath. Years passed, the 20th century arrived. The Wright brothers achieved powered flight in 1903, and suddenly the skies that had been impossible for humans to navigate became accessible. Airplanes multiplied. The impossible became commonplace, but the airship of 1897 was forgotten, relegated to the dustbin of historical oddities, a footnote in the story of American credulity. I continued working as a telegraph operator until 1918, when I retired. I married, had children, lived a quiet life, but I never forgot that night in April of 1897. I kept the tape hidden, taking it out occasionally to study it, hoping that new developments in communication technology might give me a framework for understanding the pattern. In 1920, when commercial radio broadcasts began, I felt a shock of recognition. The frequencies, the way signals were transmitted through the air, without wires, the patterns of electromagnetic waves, they echoed something I had seen in the images the being had shown me. The future I had glimpsed was beginning to arrive. I took out the tape and studied it again, this time with knowledge of radio technology, and slowly, over the course of months, a pattern began to emerge. The sequences on the tape corresponded to frequency intervals, not exact matches, but close enough that the correlation couldn't be accidental. The message was a map of the electromagnetic spectrum, highlighting specific ranges that would become useful for human communication. They'd given me a guide to radio frequencies before we had discovered radio. I sat at my kitchen table, the tape spread out in front of me, and understood fully for the first time what had happened. The airship had not been exploring our world. It had been monitoring our technological development, waiting for the moment when we created infrastructure for long-distance communication. The telegraph network had been the trigger, the sign that humanity was transitioning from isolated communities to a connected civilization. And they had come to observe that transition, to record it, perhaps to encourage it by leaving behind information we would eventually be able to understand. They were tracking the moment we became detectable across interstellar distances, the moment our signals began radiating out into space. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. We had been noticed, we had been deemed worthy of observation, perhaps even assistance, but we had also revealed ourselves, broadcasting our presence to anyone or anything capable of detecting electromagnetic radiation. We had become visible. Chapter 10. Understanding Too Late. I am writing this account in 1932. I am 78 years old. My hands shake when I hold a pen, and my eyesight is failing. But I feel compelled to record what I experienced, what I understood, even if no one believes it. The world has changed dramatically since 1897. Radio is everywhere. Telephones connect continents. Television is beginning to emerge. The network of communication that I glimpsed in those images, shown to me by the being from the airship, has become reality. We are connected now in ways that would have seemed magical to someone from my youth, and we are broadcasting constantly. Radio waves carrying music and news and voices radiate out from our planet in every direction, travelling at the speed of light, reaching farther into space with every passing year. We have become a beacon, announcing our presence to any civilization capable of detecting it. I look at the tape sometimes, the message sent to me that night in the rail yard. I understand it now, mostly. It was a primer, a basic guide to the frequencies we would need for effective communication. It was meant to help us, or perhaps to accelerate our development. I don't know if the being expected me to share this information, or if it simply assumed that we would discover these things on our own, and the message was merely confirmation. I never shared it. Perhaps that was a mistake. Perhaps I should have given the tape to scientists, let them study it, let them use the information to advance our technology faster. But I was afraid of being labelled insane, afraid of the attention it would bring, afraid of what it might mean if the information was taken seriously. So I kept silent, and the world developed radio on its own, following the natural progression of scientific discovery. Maybe that was how it was supposed to happen. Maybe my role was simply to witness, to understand, to record. I have thought often about the being I met, the way it looked at me with those large golden eyes. I have wondered what it saw when it examined me. Did it see an intelligent creature, worthy of contact? Or did it see a primitive organism, barely beginning to understand the universe it inhabited? Did our brief communication mean anything to it, or was I simply a data point, one among thousands, recorded and filed away? I have also thought about why they came when they did. The telegraph was not the first human technology. We had been building and creating for thousands of years, but the telegraph was different. It was the first technology that allowed instant communication across vast distances, the first that created a network, a web of connection that covered the continent. It was the moment when we stopped being isolated and started being unified. That was what interested them. Not our tools or our weapons or our buildings. Our ability to communicate. Our transition from scattered tribes to a connected civilization. They were observing a threshold being crossed, a moment of transformation. And now, as I write this in 1932, I wonder if they are still watching. Radio has existed for over a decade. Our signals are spreading through space, reaching farther every day. Have they detected those signals? Are they observing our continued development? Will they return? I don't know, but I suspect they don't need to return. They came at the crucial moment, the beginning. They recorded what they needed to record, and now they are waiting, watching from a distance as we continue to evolve, as we continue to build our networks, as we continue to broadcast our presence to the universe. We think we are alone. We think the vast silence of space confirms our isolation. But I know differently. I have seen proof that we are observed. I have met a being from beyond our world, communicated with it, received information from it. We are not alone. We have never been alone. We just didn't know how to see until we learned how to speak across distance. Epilogue. The quiet warning. I will die soon. I can feel it in my bones, in the increasing fragility of my body. My daughter will inherit my belongings, including the metal box with the telegraph tape inside. I have left instructions that it should be preserved, though I doubt she will understand why. Perhaps someday, someone will find it and recognize its significance. Perhaps not. But I want to leave this final thought, this last observation that has haunted me for 35 years. The airship did not arrive when we learned to fly. It did not arrive when we built cities or created art or developed philosophy. It did not arrive when we discovered fire or invented the wheel or domesticated animals. It arrived when we learned to speak across distance, when we created networks that connected us invisibly, instantaneously, when our signals began to propagate beyond our immediate surroundings. That was the threshold. That was the moment that mattered. And if that is the case, if the ability to communicate across distance is what marks a civilization as significant, as detectable, as worthy of observation, then what happens when our communication networks expand beyond our planet? What happens when our signals reach the stars? What happens when we are not just connected to each other, but potentially connected to others? I think about this often as I sit in my chair, looking out the window at the night sky. Somewhere up there, beyond the stars I can see, are others, civilizations that learned to speak across distance long before we did, civilizations that have been broadcasting their presence for centuries or millennia, civilizations that are connected in ways we cannot yet imagine. And they are listening. They arrived when we learned to speak across distance. They observed us at that crucial moment. They left a message for us to find when we were ready. The question is not whether they will return. The question is what they heard when they listened, and whether we are ready for what comes next. This is the account of Thomas Kellerman, telegraph operator, written in the autumn of 1932. The metal box containing the telegraph tape was discovered in 1978 among his daughter's possessions. The The tape remains in a private collection. Its authenticity has never been verified, and the pattern recorded on it has never been fully decoded. But radio continues to broadcast, and somewhere, perhaps, someone is still listening. End. Before we begin tonight's investigation, if you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you could possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes a tremendous difference in helping others discover these stories. And if you'd like, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone tunes in from across the globe. Finally, if you enjoy this kind of content, please consider subscribing. It means everything to us. Now, let's begin. The quiet signal. A UFO encounter that was never meant to be seen. There are moments in life when the ordinary becomes extraordinary without warning. No fanfare, no dramatic build-up, just a quiet shift in reality that leaves you questioning everything you thought you understood about the world around you. This is not the story of a believer searching the skies for confirmation. This is not the testimony of someone who spent their nights hoping for contact. This is the account of someone who experienced something impossible during the most mundane moment of their life, in a place where nothing unusual was supposed to happen. What you're about to hear is documented through personal testimony, corroborated sighting reports, and electromagnetic interference logs that were never meant to be connected. This is the story of an encounter that arrived without sound, departed without explanation, and left behind only questions that refused to fade. This is the quiet signal. Chapter 1. A routine that breaks. The high desert of Nevada holds a particular kind of silence. Not the absence of sound exactly, but a quality of stillness that feels almost deliberate. During the day, the landscape bakes under relentless sun. At night, temperatures plummet, and the darkness becomes so complete that the Milky Way stretches across the sky like a river of light. Marcus Webb had lived on his property outside of Tonopah for 11 years. A former telecommunications technician, he had purchased the 40-acre plot specifically for its isolation. No neighbours within 5 miles, no city lights to pollute the night sky. Just sagebrush, Joshua trees, and the kind of quiet that most people find uncomfortable. Every night, Marcus followed the same routine. Around 10 in the evening, he would walk the perimeter of his property, checking fence lines and ensuring his small flock of chickens had been secured for the night. The walk took approximately 45 minutes. He knew every rock, every dip in the terrain, every angle of the landscape by heart. On the night of October 17th, 2023, Marcus began his walk as usual. The temperature had dropped to the mid-40s. Clear sky. No moon. The kind of night where you could see satellites crossing overhead like slow-moving stars. He had walked this route hundreds of times. He knew exactly how the starlight would catch on the distant mountains. He knew which parts of the fence needed extra attention. He knew the sounds of the desert at night, the occasional rustle of small animals, the distant cry of coyotes. Everything felt normal. The stars were visible in their usual configurations. Orion rising in the east, the Big Dipper hanging low in the north. Marcus wasn't an astronomy enthusiast, but he knew the sky well enough to notice if something was out of place. He was approximately 20 minutes into his walk when the first change occurred. It was subtle, so subtle that he almost didn't register it. The ambient sound of the desert, the faint whisper of wind through sage, the distant insect chirps, all of it stopped. Not gradually, instantly. Marcus paused mid-step, suddenly aware of the absolute silence surrounding him. He had experienced quiet nights before, but this was different. This was the kind of silence that felt heavy, oppressive, like the air itself had thickened. He stood motionless, listening. Nothing. Then he noticed the second anomaly. The wind had stopped completely, not died down, stopped. The sagebrush around him stood perfectly still. In 11 years on this property, Marcus had never experienced a night with zero air movement. There was always some breeze, however faint, moving across the open desert. He felt a pressure building in his ears, similar to the sensation of rapid altitude change. His pulse quickened slightly, though he couldn't identify why. Nothing visible had changed. The stars remained steady overhead. The landscape looked exactly as it should. But something fundamental had shifted in the environment around him. Marcus continued walking, telling himself he was being irrational. Probably a pressure system moving in. Unusual atmospheric conditions, nothing more. He made it another 100 yards before he saw the light. Chapter 2. The First Anomaly. The tar light appeared without warning in the southern sky, roughly 30 degrees above the horizon. It was not bright, not dramatic. In fact, Marcus almost missed it entirely because it resembled a star at first glance. But stars don't appear suddenly. They're either visible or they're not. This light had materialized in a portion of sky that had been empty moments before. Marcus stopped walking and focused on the light. It remained stationary, perfectly still. No blinking, no movement, just a steady, pale amber glow that seemed slightly larger than Venus at its brightest. His first thought was satellite, but satellites move. They cross the sky in steady arcs, taking several minutes to traverse from horizon to horizon. This light wasn't moving at all. His second thought was aircraft, but there was no sound, no engine noise, no navigation lights. Commercial flights often passed over this region, en route between Las Vegas and points north. He was familiar with how they looked. This wasn't that. Could be a drone, he reasoned. Some kind of high-altitude surveillance platform. The military operated out of several installations in Nevada. Unmanned vehicles were common in the area, but drones made noise. Even at significant altitude, you could hear them, and they typically displayed some kind of lighting pattern to maintain FAA compliance. This light was completely silent. Marcus watched it for what he estimated to be 5 minutes, though he later couldn't be certain. Time had begun to feel strange, elastic. Minutes seemed to compress and expand without warning. The light remained absolutely stationary. Then it moved. Not in the way aircraft move, with smooth transitions and predictable trajectories. This movement was instantaneous. The light was in one position, and then, without travelling the distance between, it was in another position, approximately 10 degrees to the east. No acceleration, no blur, just immediate relocation. Marcus felt his stomach, his tighten. Whatever he was looking at, it wasn't operating under normal physics. Objects don't teleport. They move through space in continuous motion. He considered going back to the house, getting his binoculars, maybe his camera, but something stopped him. A strange reluctance to take his eyes off the light, as if looking away might cause him to lose track of it entirely. The pressure in his ears increased. His hands felt cold despite the gloves he was wearing. The light remained in its new position for several more minutes. Then Marcus made a decision that he would later struggle to explain. He started walking directly toward it. Chapter 3. The light responds. Marcus moved south across his property, keeping his eyes fixed on the light. The terrain sloped gently downward, leading toward a dry creek bed that marked the southern boundary of his land. As he walked, the light remained stationary. Then, when he was approximately 50 yards from his starting position, it moved again. Same instantaneous relocation. This time shifting back to the west, maintaining roughly the same distance from his position. Marcus stopped. The light stopped. He took several steps to the left. The light adjusted its position, a subtle shift that seemed to compensate for his movement. It was tracking him. Not aggressively, not in a threatening manner, but deliberately, as if maintaining a specific distance and angle relative to his position. Marcus stood completely still, his mind racing through possibilities. Sophisticated drone, military surveillance, some kind of experimental aircraft using technology he wasn't aware of. None of those explanations felt adequate. He raised his right hand slowly, extending it toward the light. Nothing happened for several seconds. Then the light pulsed once, a brief intensification of its luminosity, lasting perhaps half a second. Marcus lowered his hand. The light returned to its steady glow. He raised his hand again. Another pulse, same duration, same intensity. It was responding to him. Marcus felt a wave of disorientation wash over him. This wasn't random. This wasn't coincidence. Whatever was generating that light was aware of his presence and was reacting to his actions. He began to feel something else. Not fear exactly. More like profound confusion, mixed with a strange sense of anticipation. As if some part of his mind recognized what was happening, even though his conscious thoughts couldn't process it. Time continued to behave strangely. He had no idea how long he had been standing there. It could have been minutes or hours. The normal reference points he used to track time, the gradual movement of stars across the sky, the cooling of the night air, all seemed unreliable. Then he noticed the second object. Chapter 4. The second layer. At first, Marcus thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. A dark spot in the sky slightly north of the light, but it wasn't moving. And it wasn't like looking at empty space. He had spent years looking at the night sky. He knew what darkness looked like between stars. This was different. This was an absence, a void, a region where stars that should have been visible simply weren't. As his eyes adjusted, the shape became more defined. It was massive, roughly triangular, or perhaps diamond-shaped. Difficult to determine exact geometry because it was only visible in silhouette, blocking the stars behind it. The object was completely dark. No lights, no surface features visible, just a black mass suspended in the sky. Marcus estimated it to be at least the size of a football field, though without knowing its exact altitude, accurate size calculation was impossible. The amber light he had been watching was positioned at what appeared to be the forward point of this dark mass, not attached exactly, more like hovering several hundred feet in front of it. The light wasn't the object, it was a marker, a reference point, something to draw attention while the actual craft remained nearly invisible against the night sky. Marcus felt his heart rate accelerate. This wasn't a drone. This wasn't any kind of conventional aircraft. This was something else entirely. The dark mass remained perfectly still. No sound, no visible propulsion, no heat shimmer or distortion of the stars around it. He tried to estimate altitude. Based on the angular size and assuming the object was as large as it appeared, it had to be at least 2,000 feet up, maybe higher. At that altitude, any conventional aircraft would be clearly audible. Helicopters, planes, jets, they all generated significant noise that carried for miles across open desert. This made no sound at all. Marcus became aware of a new sensation, a feeling of weight pressing down on him. Not physical pressure, but something else, a presence, the distinct impression that he was being observed with the same intensity he was observing the object. His thoughts began to feel strange, fragmented. Ideas would start and then slip away before reaching completion. He tried to focus on practical concerns, what to do next, whether to document this somehow, but his mind kept drifting. The pressure in his ears intensified until it became almost painful. Then the light began to pulse. Chapter 5. The signal. The pulsing wasn't regular. It wasn't like a beacon or a warning light. The intervals varied. 3 short pulses, then a long pause. 2 pulses, another pause of different duration. A single pulse. Extended pause. Marcus tried to find a pattern, some kind of sequence or code. But if there was structure to it, it remained beyond his ability to decipher. As he watched the pulsing light, something began happening in his mind. Thoughts that didn't feel like his own started emerging. Not words, not voices. Something more fundamental. Concepts, understanding, arriving fully formed without the usual process of reasoning or deduction. He suddenly knew with absolute certainty that the object was not a threat. The knowledge simply appeared in his consciousness, solid and unquestionable. He knew that what he was experiencing was not unique to him, that others had stood in similar places, at similar times watching similar lights, that this had been happening for a very long time. He knew that the object was old, not ancient in the archaeological sense, but old in a way that made human civilization seem brief and recent. These weren't thoughts he was thinking. They were information being placed directly into his awareness. Fragments of memory began surfacing. Childhood moments he hadn't thought about in decades. The face of his grandmother, who had passed 20 years ago. The specific smell of rain on desert sand. Random, disconnected pieces of his personal history rising to consciousness without prompt. Along with these memories came others that didn't belong to him. Brief flashes of perspective that weren't his own. Looking down at Earth from very high altitude, observing cities of light against dark continents, watching weather systems swirl in accelerated time. Marcus tried to resist the intrusion, but there was nothing to resist against. The information simply flowed into his mind like water finding its level. He became aware of vast distances, scales of space and time that made his entire existence feel like a single breath. The understanding that Earth was one of countless observation points, that contact, when it occurred, was rarely direct, that most encounters were passive, observational, data collection without intervention. The realization struck him that he wasn't experiencing communication. He was experiencing something more like calibration, as if his presence at this specific location and time had created some kind of intersection, a momentary overlap between 2 entirely different forms of consciousness. The pulsing continued. The pressure in his head intensified until it felt like his skull might crack. Then, without warning, it stopped. Chapter 6. Missing continuity. Marcus became aware of himself gradually, like waking from deep sleep. He was sitting on the ground. He had no memory of sitting down. The sky had changed. The stars had rotated. Orion, which had been rising in the east when he started his walk, was now high overhead. The Big Dipper had shifted significantly in its position. Hours had passed. Marcus looked at his watch. The digital display read 2:15 in the morning. Impossible. He had started his walk at 10. Even accounting for the time he had spent observing the light, it couldn't be past midnight. An hour, maybe 90 minutes at most. Over 4 hours had elapsed. He looked up. The sky was empty. No light, no dark mass, nothing but stars and the faint glow of the Milky Way. The silence had ended. He could hear wind moving through the sage again, distant coyotes calling, the normal sounds of the desert at night. Marcus stood slowly. His legs felt stiff as if he'd been sitting in the same position for a long time. His hands were numb with cold. He was approximately 300 yards from where he had first seen the light. He had no memory of walking this far. The ground around him was covered in dew. His clothing was damp. The moisture suggested he had been motionless for hours while condensation formed on the fabric. He tried to reconstruct the missing time. After the pulsing stopped, what happened next? Had he watched the object depart? Had it simply vanished? When did he sit down? Why did he sit down? The memories refused to form. There was a clear before, the period of observation, and the strange information flowing into his mind. And there was a clear after, the moment of regaining awareness, sitting on cold ground. But the transition between those states was gone, erased, a clean gap in continuity. Marcus felt a wave of nausea. He bent forward. Hands on his knees, breathing slowly until the sensation passed. When he straightened up, he noticed something else. His phone was in his hand. He didn't remember taking it out of his pocket. The screen was on, displaying the camera app. According to the timestamp, the app had been active for over 2 hours, but there were no photos in his gallery, no videos. The camera had been running, aimed at nothing, saving nothing. Marcus turned off the phone and put it back in his pocket. He began walking back toward his house, moving carefully across the uneven terrain. Every few steps he would stop and look up, scanning the sky for any sign of the light or the dark mass. Nothing, just stars and empty space. By the time he reached his house, the eastern horizon was beginning to show the first pale hints of dawn. He had lost an entire night. Chapter 7. The After Effects. Marcus spent the following day in a state of exhausted confusion. He had slept for perhaps 2 hours, fitful and interrupted by dreams he couldn't quite remember upon waking. He tried to approach the experience rationally. He sat at his kitchen table with a notebook and attempted to document everything he could recall. The timeline, the observations, the sensations. But when he tried to describe the period when information had been flowing into his mind, he found the memories slippery, like trying to remember a dream that fades the moment you try to articulate it. He knew things had been communicated. He knew he had understood something profound, but the specific content refused to solidify into language. Over the next several days, Marcus noticed other changes. His digital watch stopped working. The display would glitch, showing impossible times or strings of random numbers. He replaced the battery twice before finally accepting the device was malfunctioning beyond repair. His laptop experienced similar issues. Random crashes, programs opening on their own, the Wi-Fi connection dropping repeatedly despite his router showing full functionality. The problems were brief, lasting only about a week before electronic devices began functioning normally again. But during that period, technology seemed unreliable in ways that defied simple explanation. His sleep became irregular. Not insomnia exactly, but a disruption of his normal patterns. He would feel exhausted at odd hours, wide awake when he should have been tired. His circadian rhythm had been knocked off balance. Certain sounds began causing strong reactions. The hum of electrical transformers, the specific frequency of wind moving across power lines, high-pitched tones at the edge of hearing. These sounds would trigger brief moments of vertigo and the sensation of being watched. Marcus told no one about the encounter, not because he feared ridicule. He had lived long enough to be indifferent to others' opinions, but because discussing it felt wrong somehow, like talking about it would diminish the experience or invite attention he didn't want. There was also the matter of what he would say. How do you describe missing time? How do you explain knowledge that appeared in your mind without source? How do you convey the certainty that you were observed by something utterly foreign to human experience? He continued his nightly walks, following the same route. Part of him hoped for a repeat encounter. Part of him dreaded it. The sky remained normal. Stars, satellites, occasional aircraft with their blinking navigation lights. Nothing unusual appeared, but the sense remained that something unfinished had occurred, as if the encounter on October 17th had been an introduction, not a conclusion. 3 weeks passed before Marcus discovered he wasn't alone in what he had experienced. Chapter 8. Subtle Confirmations. Marcus made the discovery by accident. He had driven into Tonopah for supplies, stopping at the small general store that served the rural community. While waiting in line, he overheard 2 local ranchers talking. One was describing interference with his radio equipment. Multiple nights over the past month, strange patterns of static that would last for hours and then suddenly stop. The other mentioned his wife had seen unusual lights south of their property. Wouldn't talk much about it. Seemed disturbed by the experience. Marcus didn't interrupt the conversation, but afterward, he began paying attention to local talk with new interest. A comment from a gas station attendant about her dog refusing to go outside for 3 nights straight, just standing at the door and whining. A mention in the local weekly newspaper about residents reporting power fluctuations and electronic interference during the 2nd week of October. A post on a regional online forum describing a large dark shape blocking stars observed from a location 30 miles west of Tonopah. None of the accounts were detailed. None explicitly described the same event Marcus had experienced. But there were consistent elements. Silence during the encounters, a sense of time distortion, electronic interference in the days following, and notably, a reluctance to discuss the experiences in detail. Marcus began researching historical reports from the area. Tonopah had a long association with military testing and unusual aerial phenomena. The region had been used for classified aircraft development for decades, but the sightings he was finding didn't match standard explanations of experimental aircraft. The descriptions were too consistent across too many years. Lights that responded to observers, objects that moved in physically impossible ways, encounters that left witnesses confused rather than frightened. He found a reference to a Department of Energy report from 1998 documenting unexplained electromagnetic interference at a monitoring station approximately 40 miles from his property. The interference occurred in irregular patterns over a 3-month period and then ceased completely. No cause was ever determined. He found testimony from a former air traffic controller describing radar contacts that would appear and disappear without explanation. Objects that would accelerate beyond the capability of any known aircraft. The controller had filed reports. Nothing had come of them. He found a letter to the editor in a 1976 issue of the local paper, written by a resident describing an encounter nearly identical to what Marcus had experienced. The letter writer described missing time, electronic disturbances, and a profound sense that they had been observed by something non-human. The accumulated evidence suggested a pattern of activity stretching back decades: periodic encounters, passive observation, minimal interaction, no hostility, no obvious purpose. Marcus realized he was part of something ongoing. Whatever had observed him on October 17th had been observing this region for a very long time. The question wasn't whether the encounters were real, the question was what they meant. Chapter 9. Reframing the encounter. Marcus spent considerable time thinking about frameworks, ways to understand what had happened to him. The popular conception of alien contact involved communication, messages, warning about nuclear weapons or environmental destruction, offers of technology or spiritual enlightenment, dramatic interaction with clear purpose. His experience had been nothing like that. There had been no message, no warning, no attempt at meaningful exchange. Just observation, the collection of data, a momentary intersection between two forms of awareness that operated on completely different scales. He began thinking about his own experience observing wildlife. How many times had he watched birds or rabbits on his property without any desire to interact? He was simply noting their presence, their behaviour, their patterns. Perhaps that was closer to what had happened. Not first contact, not communication, just observation by something that regarded humans the way humans might regard interesting but limited creatures. The thought was humbling and strangely liberating. It suggested the encounters weren't about humanity at all. We weren't the focus. We were simply part of the landscape being observed. The information that had flowed into his mind during the encounter, the sense of vast distances and ancient perspectives, supported this interpretation. Whatever had observed him existed on scales of time and space that made human concerns essentially irrelevant. They weren't here to save us or destroy us or guide us. They were here to watch, to document, to collect data from countless worlds across spans of time humans couldn't comprehend. Most encounters, Marcus now believed, were probably passive, brief overlaps, moments when observation systems became visible to those being observed. The silence made sense in this context. Why would you announce your presence when your purpose was simply to watch? The missing time made sense. If the observation involved detailed scanning or data collection, the process might require extended periods. The human mind, unable to process or remember such alien procedures, would simply skip over them, creating gaps, clean breaks in continuity. The electronic interference made sense as a side effect. Technologies designed to operate on entirely different principles might generate electromagnetic signatures that disrupted human electronics as a simple byproduct of their function. Even the reluctance to discuss the encounters made sense. Some part of the human mind recognized these experiences as different from normal reality, set apart, not to be integrated into regular conversation or normal life. Marcus realized he would probably never understand the full purpose of what had happened to him. The gap between human consciousness and whatever intelligence had observed him was too vast, but understanding the purpose wasn't necessary. The encounter had happened. It was real. It had been documented in his memory, in the subtle confirmations he had discovered, in the pattern of similar events stretching across decades. That was enough. Epilogue. The signal remains. 4 months after the encounter, Marcus returned to the location where he had regained awareness, sitting on the cold ground. It was February. Clear night, temperature near freezing, the same profound silence that characterized the high desert in winter. He stood in the exact spot, looking up at the southern sky. Nothing unusual appeared. The stars moved in their normal patterns. A satellite crossed overhead, following its predictable arc from horizon to horizon. Distant aircraft lights blinked in standard navigation patterns. The sky looked completely ordinary. But as Marcus stood there, he felt something. Not presence, not observation, just a faint recognition. As if the location itself remembered what had happened. He thought about all the people who had stood in similar places, looking up at similar skies, experiencing similar encounters, scattered across the world, across decades, perhaps across centuries, all of them returning to normal life, carrying memories of something that refused to fit into standard explanations. All of them knowing they had experienced something real, while lacking the language or framework to fully describe it. Marcus looked up at the stars for a long time, then he walked back to his house, following the same path he walked every night. The routine had resumed. Life had returned to normal patterns, but something fundamental had changed in how he understood his place in the universe. He was not alone in the cosmos. Earth was not unobserved. Human activity was being documented by intelligences that operated beyond human comprehension. And sometimes, rarely, the watchers became visible, not to communicate, not to intervene, just to remind us that we're seen. The encounter was over. The object had departed. The missing hours would never be recovered, but the signal remained. A quiet certainty that something vast and ancient had taken note of one human being on one night in the Nevada desert, and perhaps in ways he would never understand, was still watching. The stars continued their eternal rotation. The desert maintained its silence, and Marcus Webb carried on with his life, changed by an encounter that was never meant to be understood, only remembered. Devil's Hollow, Wyoming. Population 843. The kind of town where everyone knows your name, your parents' names, and probably what you had for breakfast. It sits in a valley surrounded by pine forests and abandoned copper mines. The kind of place that feels like it exists outside of time. In the summer of 1998, that feeling became terrifyingly literal. The town got its name from a legend nobody quite remembered the origin of anymore. Some said it was because of the way wind howled through the valley in winter, creating sounds that the first settlers swore were voices. Others claimed it was named after a prospector who went mad in the mines back in the 1800s, raving about something he'd seen in the deepest shaft before he disappeared. But mostly, people just lived with the name and didn't think too much about it. That was before the blackout, before we learned that some names are warnings. It was a Thursday night in late June when the power went out. Not unusual for a rural town with aging infrastructure. What was unusual was everything else that went with it. Jenny Matsuda was working the late shift at the Route 26 diner when it happened. She told me later that she'd been pouring coffee for Travis Burke, the night dispatcher, when every light in the place just died. Not a flicker, not a brownout, just instant, complete darkness. The coffee maker stopped mid-brew. The old Wurlitzer jukebox that had been playing Patsy Cline went silent. Even the exit signs went dark, which shouldn't have been possible. They were supposed to have battery backups. Travis's radio, the one he kept clipped to his belt, went dead mid-transmission. He'd been talking to a trucker passing through, giving directions to the gas station, when the voice just stopped. Static stopped. Everything stopped. The lights didn't flicker. They died. All at once. Every house, every street lamp, the gas station, the diner, everything. But it wasn't just the electricity. Car engines that had been idling suddenly choked and died. The payphone outside the post office went silent mid-conversation. Sharon Murphy had been talking to her sister in Cheyenne, and she said the line didn't disconnect. It just went quiet, like someone had hit a mute button on the entire world. Even battery-powered devices, flashlights, radios, watches stopped working. Old man Henderson's pacemaker stuttered. He felt it skip, felt his heart lurch in his chest, and for 4 minutes and 37 seconds, he genuinely thought he was dying. The device kicked back in just as suddenly as it had failed, but those minutes aged him in ways that had nothing to do with his heart. For exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds, Devil's Hollow existed in complete silence and darkness. The silence was the worst part. That's what people said afterward. In a rural town, you get used to background noise, the hum of electrical transformers, the distant sound of trucks on the highway, dogs barking, the wind. But this was different. This was the kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums, that made you aware of your own heartbeat, your own breathing. It was a silence that felt deliberate, intentional. Martha Chen, no relation to Tom, despite what people thought, was putting her 3-year-old daughter to bed when the blackout hit. She told the sheriff later that in that darkness, she'd heard her daughter whisper, "Mommy, why did the stars stop singing?" Martha had no idea what that meant. Her daughter couldn't explain it later, but something about those words stuck with all of us when the story got around. Then, just as suddenly, the battery devices came back. Flashlights buzzed to life, their beams cutting through the darkness like searching fingers. Radios crackled with static. Watches resumed ticking, but the main power stayed dead, and the cars wouldn't start. People turned keys in ignitions and got nothing. No click, no whine, just silence. It would be 3 days before the town had electricity again. 3 days that would change everything. Marcus Webb was one of the first to notice something stranger than a simple blackout. Marcus ran a ham radio setup from his garage, a hobby he'd maintained since his Air Force days in the early 70s. He'd been stationed in Germany during the Cold War, monitoring Soviet communications, and the habit of listening had never left him. When his equipment came back online, he immediately tried to reach other operators in the region. Casper, Laramie, even Salt Lake if conditions were right. What he got instead was something he'd never heard before in 3 decades of radio operation. Every frequency was flooded. Not with voices or Morse code or even normal static. It was a pattern, rhythmic, pulsing, almost like breathing, followed by short bursts of tones that rose and fell in mathematical precision. And it was everywhere. AM, FM, shortwave, every single frequency was carrying the same signal. Marcus worked his way through the dial, expecting to find gaps, dead zones, something. But no, from the lowest frequencies his equipment could pick up to the highest, The pattern was there. Consistent, unwavering, patient. Marcus recorded it on his old Tascam cassette deck, played it back. The pattern repeated every 43 seconds, always the same, always precise, no variation, no drift. Whatever was generating this signal had accuracy that made atomic clocks look sloppy. He called his fellow operators on the backup landlines that finally started working the next morning. Ed Kowalski in Casper confirmed it. Linda Yamamoto in Laramie heard it too. Even a guy Marcus sometimes talked to in Fort Collins, Colorado, picked it up. The signal was regional, covering roughly a 100-mile radius, with Devil's Hollow at its exact centre. Marcus sat in his garage that first morning, headphones on, listening to the pattern repeat. He'd heard a lot of strange things over the years. Numbers stations broadcasting codes to spies, mysterious pings from submarines, atmospheric phenomena that created ghost signals. But this was different. This had structure, intelligence, and it scared him in a way he couldn't articulate. But before anyone could make sense of the signal, something else happened. Something people could actually see. Chapter 1. The meteor that wasn't. James Carver saw it first. He was driving back from a late shift at the lumberyard, his old Ford pickup rattling along County Road 12, when the sky lit up. A bright streak, brilliant white with hints of blue at the edges, tearing across the darkness above the tree line. His first thought was meteor. You saw them sometimes out here, away from city lights, streaking across the sky in brief flashes of cosmic fire. His second thought, after watching it for several seconds, was that something about it felt wrong. Meteors fall fast. They fragment. They leave trails of sparks and burning debris. They scream through the atmosphere with visible friction, often breaking apart in spectacular fashion before they hit the ground. This thing did none of that. It moved too slowly, like it was descending rather than falling, like something with intention rather than something surrendering to gravity. There was no tail streaming behind it, no fragmentation, no pieces breaking off in glowing arcs, and most unsettling of all, there was no sound. James had seen enough meteors in his 46 years to know what they looked like. This wasn't that. This was controlled, deliberate. He could track its movement as it descended, following its arc with his eyes, watching as it dropped below the horizon with the steady, measured pace of something landing rather than crashing. He pulled over and got out of his truck, boots crunching on the gravel shoulder, watching as the object disappeared beyond the tree line to the east, somewhere deep in the forest near the old Marston mining fields. He waited for an impact sound, an explosion, the crack of trees being torn apart, anything. Nothing came, just silence and the soft rustle of wind through pine needles. The summer air smelled like sap and dry earth. Normal. Everything felt normal, except for the fact that something impossible had just fallen from the sky without making a sound. James stood there for 10 minutes, waiting, watching the forest. The glow from the object had left an afterimage in his vision, a blue-white streak that faded slowly. He considered driving out to the Forest Service road, trying to get closer, but something stopped him. A feeling, instinct honed by years of hunting in these woods. The feeling you got when you were being watched, when you were in the presence of something that didn't want to be disturbed. He got back in his truck and drove home, told his wife Linda what he'd seen. She believed him. James wasn't the type to exaggerate or make things up, but she also convinced him to wait until morning, to call the sheriff when the sun was up, and things made more sense. By morning, half the town was talking about the meteor. Turned out James wasn't the only one who'd seen it. Sarah Kwan, who lived on the eastern edge of town, saw it from her porch. The Brennan twins, Tommy and Michael, were out night fishing at Copper Lake and watched it descend beyond the ridge. Even Pastor Robert Mills saw it, interrupting his late-night sermon preparation to step outside his church and watch the sky light up. The other half of town hadn't seen it and thought the first half was exaggerating. You know how it is in small towns. A shooting star becomes a meteor, becomes a spacecraft, depending on who's telling the story and how many beers in they are. But when the sheriff's office got calls from 6 different people reporting the same thing, describing the same slow descent, the same silent fall, they decided to organise a search party. Not because they thought it was important, but because it gave people something to do during the blackout. And maybe, just maybe, there was something out there worth finding. That's how I got involved. My name is Alex Rivers, and I was home for the summer after my second year studying geology at the University of Montana. I'd grown up in Devil's Hollow, left for college with big plans of never coming back, and then found myself returning every summer anyway. There was something about this place that held on to you, the quiet, the familiarity, the way the mountains looked at sunset. I told myself it was just temporary, that I'd finish my degree and move somewhere important, somewhere with actual geology to study that wasn't just old copper mines and sedimentary rock. When Sheriff Harding asked for volunteers to help search the old mining area, I jumped at the chance. Not because I believed in meteors or alien spacecraft or any of that. I just wanted to see what kind of impact crater a slow-moving object might make. It was the kind of thing that could make for an interesting paper. Maybe even get me some attention from the department. I was 20 years old and still believed that academic recognition mattered more than lived experience. I'd learn otherwise soon enough. There were 8 of us in the search party. Sheriff Harding, a solid man in his 50s who'd run this town with quiet competence for 15 years. His deputy, Ramon Torres, younger by a decade, sharp-eyed and thorough. Marcus Webb, with his radio equipment, still trying to make sense of the signal that wouldn't stop. 3 local volunteers, including a rancher named Bill Hutchins, weathered, practical, the kind of man who could fix anything with duct tape and patience. A high school science teacher named Patricia Lowell, who taught chemistry and physics with genuine passion. And Gregory Marsh, a retired engineer who'd worked on missile systems back in the day and had more questions than anyone about what we might find. And me, the geology student home for the summer, the one who thought he was smart enough to explain anything. We set out at dawn, hiking into the forest with compasses, maps, and a general direction based on witness reports. The morning was cool, mist still clinging to the low spots, dew heavy on the grass. Sheriff Harding had his service weapon, Ramon carried a first aid kit and flares, Marcus had his portable radio gear strapped to a frame pack. We looked like a search and rescue team, heading out to find a lost hiker, except we were looking for something that had fallen from the sky. The forest was quiet, too quiet. I remember Patricia mentioning it first. Where were the birds? It was summer, late June. The woods should have been alive with sound. Warblers and chickadees, woodpeckers hammering away at dead trees, crows calling from the canopy. Instead, we walked through silence, broken only by our footsteps and the occasional crack of a branch. Even the insects seemed subdued. No mosquitoes buzzing around our heads, no flies, just stillness and the smell of pine and earth. "This is wrong," Patricia said quietly, adjusting her backpack straps. "I've been hiking these woods for 20 years. I've never heard it this quiet." Gregory nodded, his engineer's mind already working through possibilities. Animals respond to seismic activity sometimes, earthquakes. Maybe whatever landed put out some kind of pressure wave, scared everything off. "Maybe," Marcus said, but he didn't sound convinced. He had his radio out, listening to that strange signal through a small earpiece. The pattern's stronger here, definitely coming from somewhere in this direction. We searched for 3 hours, spreading out in a grid pattern, staying within sight of each other. The Forest Service had cut trails through here decades ago, but they were overgrown now, barely visible under years of deadfall and new growth. We followed compass bearings, called out to each other, marked trees with coloured tape to show where we'd been. Bill found it. He'd been working the northern edge of our search grid when he called out, his voice tight with something that wasn't quite fear but close to it. Got something here. You all better come see this. We converged on his location, pushing through a dense thicket of undergrowth that grabbed at our clothes and scratched at exposed skin. And then we were through, standing in a small clearing that shouldn't have existed. The clearing itself was unusual, perfectly circular, about 30 feet across, with the grass pressed flat in a radial pattern, like something had pushed down from above with immense, even pressure. Every blade of grass, every small plant, all bent outward from a central point in perfect geometric precision. The trees at the edge of the clearing leaned away, their branches twisted as if they'd been blown by a powerful wind, except the damage was uniform, circular, impossible. And in the centre, partially embedded in the soil, was a sphere. Chapter 2. The metallic sphere. None of us spoke for a long moment. We just stood at the edge of the clearing, staring. The sphere sat there like a piece of the moon had fallen to earth, like something that belonged in a museum or a laboratory, not in a clearing in the Wyoming wilderness. It was roughly 6 feet in diameter, perfectly smooth, made of something that looked like polished metal, but didn't quite behave like any metal I'd ever seen. The surface was mirror bright, reflecting the surrounding forest with crystal clarity. Sunlight bounced off it in ways that seemed wrong, creating patterns that shifted and moved even though the sphere itself was perfectly still. The reflection showed the trees, the sky, us standing there, frozen at the forest's edge, but there was something off about the reflection. It took me a moment to realise what it was. The reflection was delayed. When Deputy Torres took a step forward, his reflection followed a second or two behind, like the sphere was showing us the very recent past instead of the present moment. Like it was recording reality and playing it back with a lag. It was subtle enough that you could miss it if you weren't paying attention, but once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. "What the hell is that?" Ramon asked, his voice barely above a whisper. No one had an answer. I moved closer, my geology training kicking in despite my confusion. If this was a meteorite, and I was rapidly becoming certain it wasn't, then the impact site was all wrong. There should have been a crater, displaced soil, signs of violent contact with the ground. Instead, the sphere sat in a shallow depression, maybe a foot deep, as if it had simply pressed itself into the earth with patient insistence, rather than crashing into it with the force of orbital velocity. No one wanted to be the first to touch it. We stood in a circle, staring, each of us trying to process what we were looking at. There were no seams, no hatches, no markings of any kind. No scorch marks from atmospheric entry, no debris field, no fragments of material scattered around the impact site. Just this perfect, impossible sphere sitting in the dirt, like it had always been there, like it had grown from the earth itself. Sheriff Harding finally stepped forward, practical and decisive as always. "Well, standing here staring won't tell us anything." He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, wrapped it around his palm, old cop instinct to avoid leaving fingerprints, and placed his hand against the surface. He jerked back immediately, eyes wide. "It's cold," he said. "Really cold." Patricia pulled out a portable thermometer from her pack, the kind she used in her classroom for chemistry demonstrations. She held it near the sphere's surface without touching it, waiting for the digital readout to stabilise. She frowned at the reading, then moved the thermometer to different spots around the sphere, checking, double-checking. 28, Degrees, she said. That's below freezing. In June? Ramon asked. In direct sunlight, Patricia added, her voice distant, analytical. That's impossible. Something this temperature should be warming up, absorbing heat from the environment. But look, she pointed at the thermometer. It's maintaining a constant temperature. The reading isn't changing. It's like whatever this thing is made of is actively rejecting heat. Gregory moved around the sphere, examining it from different angles without touching. His engineer's eye catalogued details. No visible power source, no exhaust, no radiation that I can detect. He pulled a small Geiger counter from his pocket. Watched the needle stay flat. Whatever it's made of, it's not radioactive, at least not radioactive enough to register. I knelt down to examine where the sphere met the soil. The earth around it was frost-covered. Tiny ice crystals clinging to grass and roots, despite the warm summer air. The ground was hard, frozen solid in a ring about 3 feet wide. Beyond that ring, the soil was normal. Dark, soft, damp with morning dew, but inside that circle, winter had come and stayed. The sphere had sunk about 8 inches into the ground, but the soil beneath looked compressed, not displaced, as if the sphere had pushed the earth down rather than through, like pressing your thumb into clay. I pulled a knife from my pocket and tried to scrape some of the frozen soil. The blade skittered across the surface, barely making a mark. The ground was hard as concrete. That's when Bill reached out and touched it. Before any of us could stop him, before any of us could warn him about unknown materials and potential contamination, his hand was flat against the surface. He stood there for a long moment, his expression blank, and then he spoke very quietly. "It's vibrating," we all heard it then. Once Bill said it, once we knew to listen for it, we all felt it. A faint hum, barely perceptible at the edge of human hearing, felt more than heard. It was coming from the sphere, a low rhythmic pulse that seemed to resonate in the chest, in the bones, in the hollow spaces behind your eyes. Not quite a sound, more like a sensation, a pressure that rose and fell with metronomic precision. Marcus pulled out his radio equipment. The signal we'd been hearing since the blackout was stronger here. Much stronger. He adjusted dials, fine-tuned frequencies, and played the signal through his portable speaker. The pattern matched. The rhythm matched. The pulse we were feeling from the sphere synchronized perfectly with the tones coming from the radio. "Whatever this thing is," Marcus said, his voice shaking slightly, "it's the source. This is what's been broadcasting. This is what killed the power. This is..." He stopped, looking at the sphere with something approaching awe. "This is transmitting, calling, like a beacon." Patricia suggested we take photographs and measurements, document everything. Before we decided what to do next, she had a 35mm camera in her pack, professional quality, the kind serious hikers carried. Gregory had a tape measure and a notebook. I had my geology field journal and a collection bag for samples, though I wasn't sure what kind of sample I could possibly take from something this impossible. We spent the next 20 minutes recording every detail we could. Patricia circled the sphere, taking photographs from every angle. I sketched the clearing, measured the diameter of the flattened grass, took temperature readings from the frozen soil. Gregory measured the sphere itself, called out dimensions, noted the perfect smoothness of the surface. Marcus recorded the audio, capturing that steady pulse, that patient signal. The sphere sat there, cold and perfect and utterly alien, while we documented it like scientists examining a butterfly under glass. Like we had any idea what we were looking at, like our measurements and photographs and sketches could somehow make this make sense. That's when we lost time. Chapter 3. The Missing Time. One moment I was crouched next to the sphere, taking notes on the frost patterns in my field journal. I'd just written down the temperature gradient, how the frozen ring extended exactly 37 inches from the sphere's surface in all directions, and was starting to sketch the crystalline structure of the ice formations when everything shifted. The next moment, I was standing 15 feet away, near the edge of the clearing, my notebook on the ground behind me. My pen was in my hand, but the cap was on now. I didn't remember capping it. The sun had moved a lot. The shadows were longer, stretching across the clearing in directions they hadn't been before. My watch showed 27 minutes had passed. 27 minutes I had absolutely no memory of. I looked around wildly. Everyone else was scattered around the clearing, all of them looking equally confused. Patricia was holding her camera, staring at it like she'd never seen it before. The lens cap was on. She didn't remember putting it on. Marcus was on his knees, his radio equipment spread out around him, as if he'd been in the middle of packing it up. But he was just staring at the gear, his hands hovering over the dials, uncertain. Sheriff Harding and Ramon were standing together near the tree line, both looking pale. Gregory was sitting on a fallen log, his notebook open in his lap, but his expression was distant, confused. Bill was still the closest to the sphere, but he'd moved. He was sitting on the ground now, about 10 feet from where he'd been standing when I'd last seen him consciously. "Did we?" Ramon started, then stopped. His hand went to his service weapon, touched it, reassured himself it was still there. What just happened? "I don't know," Sheriff Harding said. His voice was steady but tight, controlled. "Everyone okay? Anyone hurt?" We did a quick check. No one was injured. No one was missing. But we were all disoriented, all trying to reconcile the fact that we'd apparently continued functioning for 27 minutes without any conscious awareness of what we were doing. "My camera," Patricia said. She was checking the frame counter on her Nikon. "I've taken 8 more photos. 8 photos I don't remember taking." Her hands were shaking slightly as she advanced the film, listening to the mechanical whir. What did I photograph? Bill was the only one still near the sphere. He was sitting on the ground, staring at his wrist. His sleeve was pushed up. There was a mark there, a perfect circle about the size of a quarter, red and raised like a brand, but without any sign of burning or blistering. The skin looked normal except for the colour and the perfect geometric precision of the circle. It looked almost like a stamp, like someone had pressed a seal into his flesh and left an imprint. "I don't remember getting this," Bill said quietly. He touched it gingerly, expecting pain, but his expression didn't change. "It doesn't hurt. Doesn't feel like anything really, but I definitely didn't have it before." We compared watches. All of them showed the same time. The sun's position confirmed it. 27 minutes, just gone, erased, like someone had cut that section of tape out of our lives and spliced the before and after together seamlessly. We'd been conscious during that time. We'd moved around. Patricia had taken photographs. Marcus had rearranged his equipment. But the memory of it was just gone. Gregory was the first to voice what we were all thinking. "This isn't natural. This isn't any kind of meteorite or weather phenomenon or atmospheric anomaly. This is something else. Something that can affect human consciousness, human memory." "We need to leave," Sheriff Harding said. It wasn't a suggestion. "We need to leave right now and call this in to someone with more resources than us. This is beyond our capability." No one argued. Whatever the sphere was, it wasn't safe. It had done something to us, changed us, stolen time from us. We marked the location on our maps, took a final round of photographs from a distance. None of us wanted to get close to it again, and hiked back to town as quickly as we could. No one spoke much on the way back. We were all trying to process what had happened, or rather, what we couldn't remember happening. The forest was still quiet, still devoid of birds and insects, like everything with sense had fled from whatever that sphere represented. Only we had been foolish enough to approach it, to stand in its presence, to let it touch our minds. The walk back took 2 hours. 2 hours of uncomfortable silence broken only by the crunch of boots on dried leaves and the occasional snap of a branch. 2 hours of looking over our shoulders, feeling watched, feeling exposed. The forest felt different now, hostile, like we'd violated something, and the land itself knew it. When we got back to Devil's Hollow, the power was still out. But something else had changed. People were gathering in small groups, talking in hushed voices, looking at the sky with expressions of worry and fear. Something had happened while we were in the woods, something the whole town had experienced. The radios had changed. Chapter 4. The Whisper Frequency. Marcus spent that entire night analysing the recordings he'd made. Patricia joined him in his garage, along with Tom Chen, the high school physics teacher who had a background in signal processing from his graduate work at Colorado State. What they found was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. The signal wasn't random. Anyone could hear that much. But Tom, with his training in digital signal analysis and his collection of borrowed equipment from the high school science lab, discovered layers that the human ear couldn't distinguish. He'd brought a spectrum analyzer, the kind used to visualize sound waves, and when he ran Marcus's recordings through it, the pattern that emerged was extraordinary. "Look at this," Tom said, pointing to the screen. The three of them, Marcus, Patricia, and Tom, huddled around the old CRT monitor in Marcus's garage, watching colourful cascades of data flow past. The signal has structure, mathematical structure. These tonal bursts follow patterns that resemble language syntax, pauses for emphasis, repetition for meaning, variation in pitch and duration that suggests information encoding. Patricia leaned closer, her chemistry teacher's mind adapting to physics concepts. "Are you saying this is a language, that something is speaking?" "Not speaking exactly," Tom said. He adjusted a dial, isolating different frequency bands. "But communicating, yes. More than that, when I run it through a Fourier transform, I find at least 3 distinct channels of data embedded in what sounds like a single transmission. Imagine someone speaking 3 different sentences simultaneously, each on a slightly different frequency, all perfectly synchronized." "Is that even possible?" Marcus asked. "It shouldn't be," Tom said. "The processing power required to generate and maintain this level of precision over multiple channels would be, well, it would be beyond anything we have, beyond anything I know about anyway. And look here." He pointed to a section of the waveform where the pattern created tight spirals on the screen. Some of these patterns resemble coordinate mapping systems, longitude and latitude, azimuth and elevation, like it's describing locations, or maybe multiple locations, points in space. "Could it be military?" Sheriff Harding asked. He joined them around midnight, unable to sleep, drawn by the lights in Marcus's garage. "Some kind of classified satellite communication?" "Maybe," Tom said. He didn't sound convinced. "But I've consulted with military communications before. I did some contract work for the Air Force back in the 80s. This doesn't match any known protocol. The precision is beyond anything I've encountered. And if it's military, why would they choose Devil's Hollow as a broadcast centre? There's nothing strategic about our location." "Unless we're not the intended recipients," Patricia said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. What if this signal isn't meant for us? What if it's calling to something else? Something out there? The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Outside, the town of Devil's Hollow slept uneasily. The power still dead, cars still inoperable, and somewhere in the forest, that perfect sphere sat in its clearing, cold and patient and endlessly transmitting. That night, things got stranger. Animals started acting wrong. Dogs that normally barked at every passing car fell silent and refused to go outside, even for food. The Henderson family reported that their dog, Max, a normally boisterous golden retriever who would bound out the door at any opportunity, had spent the entire evening hiding under the bed, whimpering. When Jack Henderson tried to coax him out with treats, Max had just pressed himself deeper into the shadows, his eyes wide and frightened. Similar stories came from all over town. Cats wouldn't eat. Horses in the stables at the Hutchins ranch paced their stalls nervously, ears flat against their heads. Bill's cattle dog Ranger, who usually slept on the porch, had scratched at the back door until Bill let him inside, then immediately crawled under the kitchen table and refused to move. Birds disappeared. Not just a few, all of them. People started noticing it around sunset. The sky was empty. No crows gathering in their evening roosts. No sparrows chattering in the eaves. No hawks circling over the fields looking for mice. The telephone wires that normally sagged under the weight of dozens of birds were bare. The trees were silent. Even the owls, which should have been starting their nightly hunts, were absent. And the cattle. Old man Peterson called it in around midnight, his voice shaking on the landline that had finally started working. All 73 head of cattle on his ranch were standing in the north pasture, perfectly still, all of them facing east, toward the forest, toward the sphere. They wouldn't move, wouldn't respond to calls or feed, just stood there, frozen, their eyes wide and unblinking, like statues of cattle rather than living animals. Sheriff Harding drove out to Peterson's ranch to see for himself. Ramon went with him. They stood at the fence in the darkness. The ranch's emergency generator had kicked in, providing some light, and watched 73 cattle stand motionless in perfect alignment. It was one of the most unsettling things either of them had ever seen. "How long they've been like this?" Harding asked. "Since sundown," Peterson said. He was a tough old rancher who'd seen droughts and blizzards and every kind of cattle disease, but his voice was unsteady. "Won't move, won't eat, won't drink. Just standing there, staring at nothing, or staring at something we can't see." I couldn't sleep that night. The humming I'd heard at the sphere kept echoing in my head, like a phantom sound that wouldn't fade. It wasn't in my ears, it was deeper than that, in my chest, in my bones. I sat on my porch, staring out at the dark forest, and I swear I could still hear it. Faint and distant, but there, pulsing, breathing, regular as a heartbeat. The mark on Bill's wrist had started to glow, just faintly, a soft blue-white luminescence that he'd noticed when he woke up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. The mark didn't hurt, didn't itch, didn't feel hot or cold. It just glowed. He'd gone to see the town physician, old Leonard Marshall, who had practiced medicine in Devil's Hollow for 40 years and thought he'd seen everything. Leonard had no explanation for it. It wasn't a burn, it wasn't a rash, it wasn't a reaction to any known irritant or allergen. It was just there, like it had always been part of Bill's skin, pulsing gently with light that had no natural source. Patricia had noticed something too. When she developed the photographs from her camera, the 8 she didn't remember taking during the missing time, they showed the clearing from different angles, normal images, properly exposed and focused. But in 3 of them, there was something else. In the background, barely visible in the tree line, there was a shape, tall, indistinct, blurred as if the camera couldn't quite resolve it into clarity. It looked almost like a person, standing in the shadows, but the proportions were wrong, too tall, too thin, and in each photograph, it was in a slightly different position, as if it had been circling the clearing while we stood there, unconscious of its presence, lost in our missing time. When Patricia showed these photographs to the group the next morning, spread out on Marcus's workbench under the harsh fluorescent light, no one spoke for a long moment. We just stared at that blurred figure, trying to understand what we were looking at. "Was that there?" Ramon asked quietly. "Was that thing watching us?" "I don't remember seeing anything," Patricia said. "But then again, I don't remember taking these photos. None of us remember anything from those 27 minutes. "What if it wasn't there physically?" Tom suggested. "What if the camera picked up something that exists on a different frequency, something our eyes can't normally see?" It was a comforting thought, slightly less terrifying than the alternative, that something had been standing in those trees, watching us, while we stood frozen and compliant, stripped of our conscious awareness and our memories. Chapter 5. The First Contact Event. 3 days after the blackout started, the power came back. It happened at exactly 3 in the morning. Every light in Devil's Hollow blazed to life simultaneously. Bedroom lamps, street lights, the neon, sign at the gas station, the exit signs at the diner. Everything, all at once, as if someone had thrown a master switch somewhere. Car engines that had been dead roared to life in driveways, their sudden noise shattering the nighttime silence. People woke up thinking their house was on fire, thinking something catastrophic had happened, stumbling out of bed to find every appliance on, every light burning bright, the TV blaring static, because no one had turned it off when the power failed 3 days ago. The suddenness was shocking. After 3 days of darkness and silence, the return of electricity felt aggressive, violent. I woke up to my radio alarm blasting at full volume. I'd left it on maximum, trying to hear the signal better. My desk lamp burned my eyes. The overhead light in my room blazed like a small sun. It took me a full minute to orient myself, to turn things off, to restore some semblance of darkness and quiet. By dawn, everything felt normal again. Cars ran smoothly. Phones worked. The radio signal was gone, replaced by normal stations broadcasting normal programs. Morning DJs making jokes, news reports about the weather and sports scores. The emergency broadcast system running tests. Everything mundane, everything ordinary. The signal that had dominated every frequency for 3 days had simply vanished, as if it had never existed. It was as if the entire event had been a strange shared dream, except we all knew better. We'd seen the sphere, we'd lost time. Bill still had the mark on his wrist, glowing faintly even in daylight. Patricia's photographs showed that blurred figure in the trees. Marcus still had his recordings, hours of that mathematical pattern repeating endlessly. But the relief in town was palpable. Power meant refrigerators worked again. Food wouldn't spoil. The pharmacy could keep medications refrigerated. The gas station pumps would function. Life could return to normal. People wanted to believe it was over, that whatever had happened was finished, that we could move on and forget about the strange 3 days when Devil's Hollow had been cut off from the world. But the people who'd been to the clearing knew better. We knew this wasn't over. The sphere was still out there, still cold, still humming with that patient frequency. And something had changed, something had opened. A door we didn't know existed had been unlocked, and we had no idea what might come through. It started with shadows. Small things at first, movements in peripheral vision that disappeared when you turned to look directly at them. Flickers at the edge of awareness, the kind of thing you could dismiss as tiredness, as stress, as imagination. Mrs. Yamoto, who ran the town library, was one of the first to report something specific. She lived in a small house behind the library building, a neat little property with a well-tended garden and a view of the forest. 3 nights in a row she saw an orange glow between the trees behind her. "House! Always in the same spot, always around midnight, always lasting for exactly 5 minutes before fading away. The glow had texture to it, she said, movement, like firelight, but the wrong colour, too bright, too pure, nothing like a campfire or a flashlight. She'd called Sheriff Harding the first night. By the time he arrived, the glow was gone. The second night, she called again. This time Harding got there, while the glow was still visible. He saw it himself, a pulsing orange light deep in the trees, maybe half a mile into the forest. They tried to investigate, driving up the old fire road, hiking in on foot. But by the time they reached the approximate location, there was nothing there. No burn marks, no equipment, no explanation, just dark forest and the smell of pine and the sensation of being watched. Tommy Brennan, a teenager who worked at the gas station, swore he saw a figure standing in the reflection of the station window one evening. He was inside working the register during the late shift when he glanced up and saw it in the glass. Tall, very tall, too thin to be human. Standing just outside the station, perfectly still. But when he spun around to look directly at where the figure should have been, there was nothing there. Just empty concrete there and the gas pumps and the highway beyond. He told his manager, who told him to stop watching scary movies before work. But Tommy knew what he'd seen. The figure had been real, or as real as anything reflected in glass could be. It had been looking at him. He was certain of that. He could feel the weight of its attention, even through the reflection. Similar stories multiplied across town. A shape in the window that wasn't there when you looked outside. Footsteps on the porch with no one there. The sensation of being watched when you were alone. Shadows that moved independently of their sources. Nothing dramatic, nothing overtly threatening. Just wrong. A persistent wrongness that settled over Devil's Hollow, like fog, obscuring the familiar and replacing it with something alien. Then I saw it. I was in my bedroom late one evening, reading a geology textbook in a futile attempt to keep up with summer coursework. My desk faced away from the window, but the window's reflection was visible in the glass covering a poster on my wall, a map of Montana's geological features. I was taking notes when I saw movement in that reflected window, a shape, indistinct and dark, moving across the reflected image of my room. Not outside the window, that would have made sense, this was inside. In the reflection I could see my bed, my bookshelf, my closet door, and moving between them, a tall figure that shouldn't exist. It moved smoothly, gliding rather than walking, crossing from one side of the reflected room to the other. I turned, heart racing, expecting to see something behind me, but there was nothing. Just my empty bedroom. Just the bookshelf and the bed and the closet door, all exactly as they should be. I looked back at the reflected window. The shape was gone. The reflection showed only my normal room, empty except for me. I sat there for a long time, heart hammering, trying to rationalise what I'd seen. Trick of the light, fatigue, stress from the events of the past week. But I didn't believe any of those explanations. Something had been there. Not physically present maybe, but there nonetheless. Existing in some space adjacent to ours. Visible only in reflections, in peripheral vision, in the gaps between what we expect to see and what's actually there, and the humming, that low rhythmic pulse. I wasn't the only one hearing it anymore. A dozen people reported the same thing over the next few days. A steady vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Always at night. Always when they were alone. Always the same pattern as the radio signal we'd recorded. Some people heard it in their homes, others only outside. A few, like me, felt it more than heard it. A pressure in the chest, a resonance in the bones. Patricia suggested we go back to the sphere, see if it had changed. see if there was a connection between the returned power and these strange sightings. Sheriff Harding agreed, but this time he insisted we bring more people and better equipment. We organised a second expedition, scheduled for the following morning. More witnesses, more documentation, maybe, hopefully, more answers. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. The humming was louder than ever, resonating through my skull like a living thing. I stood on my porch in the darkness, staring at the dark tree line to the east, and I knew somehow that something was waiting for me out there. Not waiting to harm me, not waiting to threaten, just waiting, expectant, patient, like it had been waiting for a very long time, and had all the time in the world to wait longer. The mark on my palm, I'd noticed it that afternoon, appearing like a shadow under my skin before rising to the surface as a perfect circle, identical to Bill's, was warm. Not painfully so, but noticeably. Like I was holding something hot, like something inside me was generating heat. And in that warmth was a compulsion, a pull, an invitation I didn't understand, but felt in every fibre of my being. I should have waited for the expedition, should have waited for morning and backup and witnesses, but the pull was too strong. At dusk I found myself walking east, toward the forest, following a compulsion I didn't fully understand and couldn't resist. The humming guided me, growing stronger with each step, building in intensity until it wasn't just a sound or a feeling but something fundamental, as if the world itself was vibrating at a frequency that only I could perceive, as if I was being tuned to match something vast and patient and utterly alien. Chapter 6. The Being in the Field. I didn't go to the clearing with the sphere. The pull led me elsewhere. Instead, I found myself walking toward the Hutchins wheat field, a vast expanse of golden grain that bordered the forest on the eastern edge of Bill's property. The sun was setting, painting everything in shades of amber and crimson, turning the wheat into a sea of molten gold that rippled in the evening breeze. The field was beautiful. I'd seen it 1,000 times growing up, but tonight it looked different, more vivid, more real, like I was seeing it for the first time with eyes that actually worked. Every detail stood out with crystalline clarity. Each individual stalk of wheat, the way the light caught the grain heads, the patterns the wind made as it moved through the crops. It was overwhelming. That's when I saw it, standing in the middle of the field, maybe 200 feet away, perfectly still among the moving wheat. Something that shouldn't exist, something that couldn't exist. It was tall, impossibly tall, at least 8 or 9 feet if it was standing on the ground. The basic shape suggested humanoid proportions, but wrong. The limbs were too long, too thin, jointed in ways that didn't match human anatomy. The torso was elongated, stretched, with a grace that seemed almost boneless, and the way it stood, perfectly motionless, while the wheat moved around it, suggested a patience that felt profoundly alien. But here's what I'll never forget, what I can't adequately describe, even now, years later. I couldn't see it clearly. My eyes wouldn't focus on it. It was like trying to look at something through water, the image constantly shifting and blurring. Light bent around it, creating a haze effect that made it seem partially translucent. I could see the wheat behind it, through it, around it, all at once, as if it existed slightly out of phase with reality, occupying a space that was here but also elsewhere. The ground around it vibrated. I could feel it through my boots, through the bones of my feet, travelling up my legs and into my spine. The same humming, the same pulse coming from the earth itself. The wheat stalks near the figure bent away from it in a perfect circle, creating a zone of flattened grain about 10 feet in diameter, not pressed down by weight, but pushed away by something invisible. by presence, by intention. The creature, and I knew it was a creature, not a trick of light or a hallucination or anything my mind might have constructed, didn't move. It just stood there in the centre of that circle of bent wheat watching me, or at least I felt like it was watching me. I couldn't see eyes or a face or any features at all through the distortion. Just that tall, blurred shape that my brain refused to properly process. Every time I tried to focus on it, my vision slid away, like trying to look directly at your own blind spot. I stood frozen, heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat, every instinct screaming at me to run, to turn around and flee back to town, back to safety, back to the world I understood. Fear flooded through me, primal and overwhelming. This was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. That being shouldn't exist. The fact that it was standing there, silent and patient, violated every understanding I had of the world. But beneath the fear was something else. Curiosity, wonder. The sense that this thing, this impossible being, was waiting for me to understand something. That it had been waiting for days, maybe longer. That its presence here, in this field, at this exact moment, was deliberate, intentional, meaningful. The sun continued its descent. The light shifted from gold to deep orange to purple. The wheat turned from amber to shadow. And still we stood there, me and this thing from somewhere else, separated by 200 feet of darkening field, connected by something I didn't have words for. Time felt elastic, unreliable. I might have stood there for minutes or hours, I couldn't tell. The world had narrowed to just me, and the being, and the vibrating earth beneath our feet. Then, without any warning, without any movement, I could perceive it spoke, not in words, not in sounds, in concepts, in meanings that appeared directly in my mind, bypassing language entirely. Waiting. That was the first concept, a sense of vast patience, of time measured in scales I couldn't comprehend, of watching and waiting for something specific. Recognition. The second concept came with a flood of emotion that wasn't mine. Relief, something like joy, the sense of finally being seen after a long blindness, of connection after isolation. Home. The third concept came with images, not visual images, but something deeper. Impressions of a place I'd never seen but somehow understood. A world where light behaved differently, where distance was optional, where consciousness was the only geography that mattered. And then, as suddenly as the connection opened, it closed. The being was gone, simply not there anymore. No fade, no movement. One moment it existed, the next moment the space it had occupied was just empty field. The wheat sprang back up, releasing from whatever force had held it down. The vibration stopped. The humming faded to a whisper. I stood there, gasping, as if I'd been holding my breath for a long time. My legs felt weak, my vision swam, and I realised I was crying, tears running down my face, though I couldn't have said why. Not from fear, not from joy, just from the overwhelming intensity of whatever had just happened. I ran, I'm not ashamed to admit it. I ran back to town, stumbling through the twilight, gasping, my mind racing. I'd made contact, actual contact, not with a sphere or a signal or a distant presence, but with something alive, something conscious, something that had reached across the vast gulf between its existence and mine and touched my mind with gentle, patient intention. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. Not yet. I wasn't sure I could explain it. Wasn't sure I believed it myself. I went home, locked my door, and sat in my dark bedroom, trembling. The mark on my palm was glowing now, bright enough to read by, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. And in my mind, echoing like a memory of someone else's voice, those three concepts, kept repeating. Waiting, recognition, home. Chapter 7. The message. That night I dreamed, but calling it a dream feels inadequate. It was too vivid, too structured, too intentional, like someone else's memory being played in my head, like a message being delivered through the only channel my mind could receive. I was standing in water, not drowning, just standing, the liquid reaching my waist. But it wasn't water, it was thicker, more viscous, with a weight that water didn't have. And it glowed, a soft phosphorescence that lit the space around me from within. I could see my legs beneath the surface, distorted but visible, surrounded by gentle currents that moved without wind. I looked up and saw a sky that wasn't a sky, swirling clouds of colour that moved with mathematical precision, creating patterns that hurt to look at but were impossibly beautiful. Fractals that existed in more dimensions than I could perceive, geometric shapes that folded in on themselves in ways that violated Euclidean space. Colours that didn't have names, that my brain interpreted as something between sound and light and texture. The clouds moved in rhythm with the humming. I could hear it here, louder than ever, but it didn't hurt. Instead, it felt like music, like the fundamental frequency of existence itself, like the sound that holds reality together at its seams. Then the perspective shifted. I was moving through space, not floating, not flying, but simply moving, as if distance was optional, as if the space between one place and another was a choice rather than a barrier. I saw star maps spread out before me, like a navigation chart, constellations I didn't recognize, binary stars orbiting each other in tight spirals, nebulae forming new suns in clouds of dust and gas. Planets appeared, one by one, like images being shuffled through my mind. A world with rings of ice and dust that caught the light of a distant sun. A moon covered in cracks, frozen water welling up from below to create temporary oceans before freezing again. A gas giant with storms that had raged for millennia, large enough to swallow Earth whole. And everywhere, that same rhythmic pulse, the breathing hum that had followed me since the blackout. But here in this dream or vision, or whatever it was, I could hear variations. Harmonics, as if the signal I'd been hearing was just one voice in a vast choir, all singing different parts of the same endless song. The scene changed again. I was in a corridor, metal walls, smooth and seamless like the sphere, stretching endlessly in both directions. But these walls were alive with light. Patterns moved across them in waves like neural impulses, like thoughts made visible. The walls reflected not the present, but possibilities, potential futures branching out in infinite directions. In one reflection, I saw myself walking, but I was decades older, my hair grey, my face lined with age. In another, I was a child, young and innocent, untouched by what was to come. In a third, I was someone else entirely. Different features, different body, same consciousness, looking out through different eyes. The reflections multiplied, showing me versions of myself that might have been, could have been, would be, in timelines I couldn't navigate. At the end of the corridor was a door, and beyond the door, I somehow knew, was an answer. Not the answer to a specific question, but the answer. The fundamental truth that made everything else make sense, the key that unlocked all mysteries. I walked forward, drawn by certainty that had no rational basis. The humming grew louder, more insistent, building to a crescendo that felt like pressure behind my eyes. I reached the door, or maybe the door reached me. Space folded, and suddenly I was standing before it. But it wasn't a door. It was the sphere, but massive now, planet-sized, hanging in empty space against a backdrop of stars. and as I watched, unable to look away, it began to split open like an iris, revealing an interior that swallowed light. The opening expanded, showing me darkness so complete it felt alive, an emptiness so profound it had presence, like staring into the void between galaxies, but knowing that the void was staring back with ancient, patient awareness. Then I saw it, the planet, hanging in the darkness revealed by the sphere's opening, a world I'd never seen, but somehow recognised, covered in structures that looked like mirrors, vast crystalline formations that reflected the light of 3 suns in blinding cascades. Cities that were more like geometric concepts than buildings, architecture that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. And I understood, in that dreamlike way you sometimes understand things without words, that this was a home, someone's home, a place where consciousness didn't need bodies the way we do, where thought was matter and matter was optional, where beings could exist as pure awareness, taking form only when necessary, when interacting with species that still believed in the primacy of flesh. The planet's surface showed me more. I saw beings moving between the mirror cities, tall, graceful, their forms shifting based on context, on need, on intention. Sometimes solid, sometimes translucent, sometimes just light given temporary shape, and among them I saw the being from the wheat field. Home, whole, where it belonged. The understanding hit me like a physical force. The sphere wasn't a spacecraft, it was an escape pod, an emergency beacon, something used only in crisis. The being I'd seen had crashed here, had been stranded, separated from its home, from its people, from the fundamental reality it knew. And it had been calling, broadcasting, waiting for rescue from a civilization that existed light years away. The dream ended with an image seared into my brain. The sphere opening, revealing not emptiness but purpose. And inside, waiting with infinite patience, the tall figure from the field, waiting to return, waiting to go home, waiting for someone to understand. I woke up screaming. My sheets were soaked with sweat, tangled around my legs. The taste of copper filled my mouth. My nose was bleeding, thin streams running down over my lips, dripping onto my pillow. I fumbled for my bedside lamp, knocking over a water glass, finally finding the switch. The light revealed my room, normal and familiar. But I didn't feel normal. I felt changed, opened, like something had been written into my consciousness that I'd never be able to erase. I stumbled to the bathroom, turned on the light, looked in the mirror. My reflection looked back, pale and shaken, but my eyes looked different, more aware, more present, like I'd woken up from a lifelong dream into a wider reality. And then I saw it. I looked down at my hand, turning it over in the harsh fluorescent light. There, pressed into my palm like a stamp, was the mark. A perfect circle, red and raised, identical to the one on Bill's wrist, but mine was glowing brighter, pulsing with light that seemed to come from beneath the skin. It didn't hurt. It felt warm, and deep in my mind, beneath the panic and confusion, beneath the overwhelming weight of what I'd just experienced, I knew the truth. The encounter in the field hadn't been physical, it had been mental. The being had touched my mind, not my body, had shown me what I needed to see, had given me understanding that transcended language. And this mark was proof, evidence of contact, a sign that something vast and patient and profoundly alien had reached across the incomprehensible distance between its existence and mine, and said in the only way it could, "I see you. I recognize you. You understand." I spent the rest of the night sitting at my desk, writing everything down in my field journal. Every detail of the dream, every concept, every image, every sensation. My hand cramped from writing, but I couldn't stop. I needed to record it all before the memory faded, before my rational mind could dismiss it as just a dream, before I could convince myself it hadn't really happened. Dawn came slowly. Grey light crept through my window, painting my room in shades of uncertainty. And when the sun finally rose, bright and ordinary, I was still writing, still trying to capture the impossible, still marked by something I couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't stood in that wheat field and felt their mind touched by consciousness from another world. Chapter 8. The Sphere Awakens. By morning, the entire town knew something was happening. More people had the marks now. Bill still had his on the wrist, now glowing steadily, like a nightlight. I had mine on the palm, pulsing with my heartbeat. Patricia woke up with one on her ankle. She called me right away, her voice tight with controlled fear. Marcus had one behind his ear, discovered when he was shaving. Gregory found his on the inside of his forearm. All of us who'd been part of the original search party. All of us who'd lost time near the sphere. All of us marked, branded, changed by proximity to something we couldn't comprehend. But the sphere itself was changing too. Tom Chen, cautious and methodical, had set up a remote observation post at the clearing days ago, a weatherproof camera on a tripod, connected to a timer and a large battery pack, taking photographs every hour. Automated documentation, safe distance, no more lost time or mysterious marks. When we reviewed the images on the morning after my dream, we saw the progression. The sphere was evolving, awakening, coming alive in ways that made our initial discovery look dormant by comparison. The sphere was glowing. The first photographs, taken 3 days ago, showed nothing unusual, just the cold metallic surface reflecting the forest. But as the days progressed, the images showed change. A faint blue light emanating from within the metal, barely visible at first, then growing stronger, hour by hour, frame by frame. The glow intensifying until the latest images showed a sphere blazing with cold fire, bright enough to cast shadows in the clearing, even at noon. And the ground around it was changing. The frost had spread in a perfect circle, now extending 20 feet in all directions from the sphere's centre. But it wasn't just frost anymore. The soil was crystallizing, forming geometric patterns that looked almost like circuitry, like a vast microprocessor spreading out from the sphere as its core. The patterns were fractal, repeating at different scales, creating a network of crystalline pathways that extended deeper into the earth with each passing hour. Tom had also set up microphones, recording the ambient sound. The audio files showed the vibration growing stronger, more complex. What had been a simple rhythmic pulse had evolved into something layered, multiple frequencies overlapping, creating harmonics that shouldn't be possible from a single source. It was as if the sphere was learning to speak more clearly, fine-tuning its transmission, preparing for something. And the vibration was stronger. You could hear it now, without any equipment, a steady, rhythmic hum that echoed through the forest, that made tree branches tremble, that caused the surface of Copper Lake to ripple in concentric circles despite the absence of wind. Animals had stopped entering the area entirely. The birds were still gone. Even insects avoided the clearing, creating a zone of silence around the sphere that expanded with each passing day. Sheriff Harding wanted to call in the state police, maybe even the federal authorities. This was beyond us, beyond the capability of a small-town sheriff's department. We needed experts, scientists, military, someone who might actually understand what we were dealing with, but Marcus convinced him to wait. Just one more day. We needed to understand what was happening before the government got involved, because once they did, we'd never see or hear about any of this again. It would be classified, buried, forgotten. The truth would be locked away in some underground facility, and we'd be left with official explanations that satisfied no one. Whatever this is, Marcus said, standing in Harding's office with the rest of us, it's trying to communicate. The signal, the marks, the visions some of us have had, it's reaching out. And if we bring in the feds now, they'll shut it down, contain it. We might never know what it was trying to say. Harding didn't like it. You could see the conflict on his face, but he was also a man who'd lived in Devil's Hollow his entire life, who'd seen strange things in these mountains, who understood that some mysteries deserved answers before they were locked away forever. 24 hours, he said finally. One day. Then I'm making calls. That night, Bill collapsed. He was at home, sitting down to dinner with his wife Sarah, when he simply fell forward, unconscious, his face barely missing his plate. Sarah screamed, caught him before he hit the floor, called for an ambulance that couldn't possibly arrive in time. The mark on his wrist was glowing bright blue, brighter than it had ever been, pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. The light was strong enough to see through his skin, illuminating the bones of his arm like an X-ray, showing the network of veins and arteries carrying marked blood through his body. Sarah's next-door neighbour, a retired nurse named Helen Foster, came running at the sound of the screams. Together, they got Bill onto the floor, checked his breathing, his pulse. Both were steady. He wasn't dying, he was just absent, like his mind had gone somewhere else while his body waited for it to return. Leonard Marshall arrived within minutes, his medical bag in hand, moving with the quick efficiency of a man who'd handled countless emergencies over 4 decades of small-town practice. He examined Bill, checked his vitals, shone a light in his unresponsive eyes. Physically, he's fine, Leonard said, confusion evident in his voice. Heart rate normal, breathing normal, no signs of stroke or seizure. He's just not here. It's like he's sleeping, but I can't wake him. Bill regained consciousness 30 minutes later, gasping, his eyes flying open. The mark on his wrist had faded back to its usual dim glow. He looked around confused, trying to orient himself. I heard it, he said, his voice hoarse. I heard a voice, not in my ears, in my head. We all leaned closer. Sarah gripped his hand. Leonard listened with the careful attention of a physician cataloguing symptoms he didn't understand. What did it say? Harding asked. Bill closed his eyes, trying to recapture the memory. It was a single word repeated, over and over, but it wasn't in English, wasn't in any language I recognise, but I knew what it meant. I understood it. What did it mean? Patricia asked softly. Bill opened his eyes, looked at each of us in turn. His expression was strange, fear mixed with wonder, confusion mixed with certainty. Return. Chapter 9. The Departure. We went back to the clearing at dawn, all of us, the whole town, or near enough. Word had spread through Devil's Hollow like wildfire. People needed to see, needed to witness, needed to be part of whatever was about to happen, because everyone knew, could feel, that something was building toward a conclusion. The forest was silent as we hiked in. More than 100 people moving through the trees, trying to be quiet, trying not to disturb whatever waited ahead. Families with children, elderly residents who hadn't hiked in years but refused to miss this, teenagers with cameras, the pastor, the mayor, everyone who could walk the trail, everyone who needed to see the impossible with their own eyes. The sphere was fully luminous when we reached the clearing, glowing bright blue like a small star brought to earth, casting sharp shadows across the crystalline patterns that had spread through the soil. The frost-covered trees surrounding the clearing sparkled in the early morning light, each branch encased in ice despite the warmth of late June. The entire scene looked like something from another world, a place where different rules applied. We stood in a wide circle around the clearing, maybe 100 people, watching and waiting. No one spoke. What was there to say? We'd come to witness something beyond explanation, beyond categorization. We'd come because the alternative, staying home, pretending this wasn't happening, was impossible. The humming was everywhere now, resonating in our chests, our bones, our teeth, strong enough to feel in the soles of our feet, building, intensifying, like the earth itself was vibrating at a frequency that reality wasn't quite designed to handle. Then the sphere began to unfold. There's no better word for it. The surface, which had been seamless and solid for days, began to split along lines that hadn't existed moments before. Panels shifted and reconfigured, moving with liquid grace, making absolutely no sound. It was like watching origami in reverse, a complex shape unpacking itself into something simpler and more profound. The panels moved in ways that shouldn't be physically possible, folding through angles that hurt to look at, creating geometry that violated three-dimensional space. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, like watching reality itself rearrange its fundamental rules. The interior was revealed gradually, panel by panel, as if the sphere was being patient with us, giving our minds time to adjust to each new impossibility before presenting the next. The chamber inside was hollow, perfectly smooth, lined with the same mirror-like material as the exterior, but this interior absorbed light instead of reflecting it. Looking into it was like looking into the void of space itself, into the gaps between stars where light hasn't reached in billions of years. No machinery, no controls, no technology that we could recognize, just empty space that somehow felt occupied. That had weight and presence despite containing nothing our eyes could see, like a room that was somehow also a door, a container that was also a passage. And then we saw it, the being from the field. It materialized at the edge of the clearing, near the tree line where the frost patterns ended and normal forest began. But this time, there was no blurring, no distortion. We could see it clearly. All of us, 100 witnesses to something that shouldn't exist. It was tall. We'd known that, but seeing it clearly made the scale apparent. At least 9 feet, maybe more. Humanoid in the most basic sense. 2 arms, 2 legs, a torso, a head. But the proportions were wrong in ways that created a disturbing grace. The skin, if it was skin, was smooth and pale, with a faint opalescent quality that caught the light strangely, creating subtle rainbow patterns that shifted with each movement. The head was larger than it should be, the skull elongated, suggesting a brain cavity that could contain thoughts we'd never comprehend. The features were minimal, suggestions of eyes dark and depthless, and a mouth but nothing defined. Nothing quite human despite the overall humanoid structure. The limbs were elongated, elegant, in a way that seemed almost fragile but suggested strength we couldn't estimate. It moved toward the sphere with smooth gliding steps. There was no sound, no footsteps, no rustle of displaced air, just silence and that ever-present hum that seemed to emanate from the being itself as much as from the sphere. When it moved, space seemed to accommodate it rather than be pushed aside by it, as if reality was making room for something that existed on its own terms. It walked across the clearing, stepping carefully over the crystalline patterns in the frozen soil. Its movements were unhurried, patient, as if it had all the time in the world, or knew that time was irrelevant to what was about to happen. When it reached the sphere, it turned to face us, all of us. Its gaze swept across the crowd, and I swear it paused on me, on Bill, on Patricia and Marcus, on everyone who carried the marks, acknowledging us, recognizing us, thanking us perhaps, in the only way it could. Then it extended one arm. The hand, if you could call it that, had too many fingers, long and delicate, jointed in ways that didn't match human anatomy, and placed it against the opening of the sphere. The glow intensified, becoming almost blinding, and in that moment I understood. We all understood. The knowledge wasn't in words, it was just suddenly present in our minds, placed there by the being with gentle, patient intention. The sphere wasn't a craft in the way we think of crafts. It wasn't transportation, it was a rescue pod, an emergency beacon. This being, whatever it was, wherever it came from, had crashed here, had been stranded, separated from its home, from its people, from everything it knew, and it had been waiting, calling out, hoping for retrieval, for rescue from a civilization that existed light years away. And now finally they were coming. The opening sphere wasn't launching, it was receiving, creating a doorway, a passage, a way home that bypassed the tyranny of distance and time. The being stepped into the sphere. The opening began to close, those impossible panels shifting back into place, sealing with perfect precision. The glow reached a crescendo, pulsing once, twice, 3 times, each pulse sending out waves of pressure that we felt in our chests, that made the air shimmer, that caused the frozen trees to shake and drop fragments of ice that caught the morning light like falling stars. The humming became a single, sustained note that vibrated through everything, through the earth, through our bodies, through the air itself. A fundamental frequency that felt like the sound of the universe taking a deep breath. Then in complete silence, the sphere rose. It lifted straight up, slowly at first, with deliberate grace, no exhaust, no thrust, no jets of fire or clouds of smoke. It simply ascended, defying gravity with the same patient insistence it had shown since arriving. Rising above the trees, above the clearing, climbing into the morning sky that was brightening from grey to blue, we all watched, heads tilted back, shielding our eyes from the blue light that grew more intense as the sphere rose higher. Some people were crying, some were praying, some just watched in stunned silence, trying to imprint every detail in their memories, knowing they'd spend the rest of their lives trying to explain this moment to people who would never believe them. The sphere climbed faster now, accelerating smoothly, leaving behind a trail of distorted air that bent the light passing through it, higher and higher until it was just a point of light against the morning sky, indistinguishable from the stars that were fading with the dawn. And then it was gone. Just gone. No flash, no explosion, no sound. It simply stopped being there, as if it had stepped through a door in space and closed the door behind it. The silence afterward was profound. We stood there, 100 people, in a frozen clearing, trying to process what we'd just witnessed, trying to understand what it meant, trying to accept that we'd just watched someone go home, back to a place we could barely imagine, in a way that rewrote everything we thought we knew about the universe. In the clearing, all that remained was a perfect circle of scorched earth, still glowing faintly with a residual heat. The crystalline patterns had melted, leaving behind glass-like formations that reflected the morning light in rainbow cascades. The frozen trees were already beginning to thaw, water dripping from branches like tears. The sphere was gone. The being was gone. But the evidence remained, burned into the earth and into our memories. We stood there for a long time. No one wanted to be the first to leave. No one wanted to walk away from this place, where the impossible had become real, where we'd witnessed something that would define the rest of our lives. Eventually, slowly, people began to drift back toward town, speaking in hushed voices, holding hands, processing, grieving in a strange way, for the end of an encounter we'd barely begun to understand. Chapter 10. The government arrives. They came within hours, black SUVs with government plates, unmarked trucks with serious-looking people in suits who didn't introduce themselves or show credentials. They moved through Devil's Hollow with military precision, polite but firm, asking questions and confiscating evidence. I was in my room when they came for me. 2 men in dark suits and sunglasses, the kind of men who looked like they'd stepped out of a Cold War spy novel. They knocked once, then entered without waiting for permission. Professional, thorough, intimidating in a way that was clearly intentional. "Alex Rivers?" the taller one asked, though it wasn't really a question. He already knew who I was. "We need you to come with us. Just a few questions about recent events." They interviewed me in a makeshift command centre they'd set up in the high school gymnasium. Long tables covered with equipment, computers, recording devices, a dozen people working with focused intensity. They separated us, the search party members, made sure we couldn't coordinate stories, standard interrogation technique. The interview was polite, professional, but there was steel underneath the courtesy. They asked about the sphere, the clearing, the missing time, the marks on our skin. They photographed my palm, taking dozens of images of the circular mark from different angles, with different lighting. They took blood samples, skin samples, asked me to describe everything I'd experienced, then asked me to describe it again, looking for inconsistencies. Every photograph we'd taken was collected, every tape recording, every note. Tom's observation equipment was seized, loaded into trucks with remarkable efficiency. Patricia's camera was taken, film and all. Marcus's radio recordings disappeared into black cases with classified labels. They went through our homes with polite determination, removing anything that could serve as evidence. The official statement came 2 days later, released through the sheriff's office, but clearly written by someone in Washington. A weather satellite had malfunctioned, fell from orbit. The debris field had been contained and removed. The electrical interference was a result of the satellite's power core, experimental technology that had unexpectedly created localized electromagnetic effects. Everything was under control, nothing to worry about. Please remain calm and go about your normal lives. The statement explained everything and explained nothing. Weather satellites didn't create perfect spheres, didn't generate mathematical patterns on every radio frequency, didn't leave marks on people's skin, didn't ascend back into space in complete silence. But the statement was confident and authoritative, full of technical jargon that sounded plausible to anyone who hadn't been there. Sheriff Harding stood on the steps of the town hall and read the statement in a flat, tired voice. A crowd had gathered, maybe 300 people, all the witnesses and their families, and anyone else in town who'd heard the stories. When Harding finished, he looked out at the assembled crowd. His jaw tightened. Then he said something off script, something that probably got him in trouble with the men in dark suits. "You all know what you saw. Don't let anyone tell you different." Then he folded the statement, put it in his pocket, and went back inside. The men in suits followed him, their expressions unreadable behind their sunglasses. The crowd dispersed slowly, people talking in low voices, sharing looks that said, "We all know the truth, even if we're not supposed to say it." We all went home. What else could we do? The government had spoken. The truth had been decided. Official reality had been established, and we were just people in a small town who'd witnessed something that officially never happened. We had our memories, we had our marks, we had each other, but we had no proof, no evidence, no way to make anyone believe us, except we knew we remembered, and the marks never faded. Epilogue. 20 years later, 20 years, That's how long it's been since the night everything went silent. Devil's Hollow hasn't changed much. Still the same population, give or take a few families who moved away and a few who moved in. Still the same quiet streets and dark forests, still the same mountains standing watch over the valley. But the people here carry a secret, a shared knowledge that bonds us in ways that outsiders can't understand. I still live here. Never finished my geology degree. Didn't see the point somehow. After you've seen proof that reality's larger and stranger than any textbook can capture. After you've had your mind touched by consciousness from another world, studying rock formations seems small, limited. I came back from college after that summer and never left again. I run the hardware store now. Took it over when the previous owner retired. It's a quiet life, simple. I sell nails and hammers and paint. I help people fix their plumbing. I give advice on home repairs. It's honest work, grounding, real, and it keeps me in Devil's Hollow, in the place where everything changed. But the mark on my palm never faded. It's still there, a faint circle that most people probably wouldn't notice unless I pointed it out. Bill still has his on, the wrist. Patricia's is still visible on her ankle. Marcus's is behind his ear, hidden by his hair. Gregory passed away 5 years ago. A stroke, sudden and fatal. But I saw his mark at the funeral. Still visible on his forearm, even in death. Permanent, indelible. Proof of contact that outlasted the man who carried it. We don't talk about it much. Don't need to. We know. We see each other around town, share a look, a nod, an understanding that needs no words. We're the marked ones, the witnesses, the people who stood in that clearing and watched someone go home. The mark does something strange. It pulses, just faintly, a warmth that comes and goes. I've noticed it happens before storms, big weather systems rolling in from the west. The mark warms up about 6 hours before the first clouds arrive. It's uncanny, reliable, better than any weather report. Patricia says hers does the same thing. We've never found an explanation. Leonard Marshall studied it before he retired, took dozens of tests, found nothing unusual about the tissue itself. But the mark remains, and it pulses, and it knows when storms are coming with perfect accuracy. And the signal. Every few years, Marcus picks it up again on his ham radio, just for a few seconds. That same rhythmic pattern, those same tonal bursts. It appears without warning, floods every frequency, and then disappears just as quickly. Never long enough to record properly, never long enough to analyse. Just a brief greeting from something vast and distant, a reminder that we're remembered. The last time was 3 months ago, middle of the night. I woke up from a sound sleep, my mark pulsing warm against my palm. The phone was ringing, Marcus calling me immediately, his voice shaking with excitement. "It's back," he said, "just for 10 seconds. But it was there, the same pattern, exactly the same. I drove to his garage. We sat there together, headphones on, listening to the recording he'd managed to capture. 10 seconds of that mathematical precision, that patient signal. 10 seconds of contact with something that existed light years away, but still somehow remembered a small town in Wyoming where they'd found help. We don't know what it means. Don't know if it's a message, a greeting, a warning, or just cosmic noise that happens to sound meaningful to people who want to believe. But we choose to believe it means something. That out there, somewhere among the stars, something remembers us. Something that once needed help and found it in a place that nobody's ever heard of. The clearing in the forest is still there. The scorched circle never grew back. Nothing grows there. The soil is permanently altered, crystallized in geometric patterns that erosion can't touch. Scientists came, Real scientists, not the men in suits, and took samples, published papers about unusual silicon formations and unexplained crystalline structures, but they never knew what caused it, never knew what they were really looking at. Sometimes late at night, you can still hear a faint humming if you stand in the exact centre of that scorched circle, or maybe that's just in our heads. Hard to say. Memory and experience blur after 20 years. But I've been out there, stood in that spot where the sphere used to sit, and I swear I can feel it. That patient vibration, that fundamental frequency, like an echo that never quite fades. Tom Chen passed away 5 years ago. Heart attack. Patricia found him in his garage, surrounded by papers covered in equations, trying to decode the signal one last time. At his funeral, we noticed he'd written something on the last page of his notebook, underlined 3 times with a shaking hand. They are still listening. I think about that a lot, about the being we saw, about the sphere and the lost time and the marks that never fade, about what it means to be remembered by something that exists beyond our understanding of reality. It's humbling, terrifying, and strangely comforting all at once. Because if that sphere was a rescue pod, if that being was stranded and waiting for retrieval, then the signal we keep hearing means something important. It means whatever sent that sphere succeeded. It means they made it home. It means they remember where they found help. It means that in a vast, cold universe, full of impossible distances and fundamental isolation, connection is possible. Understanding is possible. Help is possible. And sometimes, on clear nights when the stars are bright and the forest is quiet, I stand on my porch and look up at the sky. I think about that tall, elegant being stepping into the sphere, about the silent ascent into the dawn, about worlds with mirror-covered surfaces and skies that swirl with mathematical precision, about consciousness that doesn't need bodies, about civilizations that measure time in scales we can't comprehend. And I wonder, if they're still listening, what are they listening for? What are they waiting to hear? Are they watching us, this small town in Wyoming that once sheltered something from beyond our world? Are we being observed by patient awareness that exists light years away? I don't have answers. None of us do. But we have the marks, we have the memories, we have the signal that returns like a ghost reminding us that we were part of something larger than ourselves. We were witnesses to contact, to understanding, to a moment when the vast distance between one form of consciousness and another collapsed. And for just a brief time, we were not alone. If that was a rescue, then whatever sent it is still out there, still watching, still listening, and maybe, just maybe, still grateful to the people of Devil's Hollow who looked up at the impossible and chose not to look away. The question is, what happens when they decide to visit again? I guess we'll find out. Until then, we wait, we listen, and we remember the night everything went silent and what came after. Because some stories don't end. They just pause, waiting for the next chapter to begin. And I have a feeling, deep in the place where the mark pulses against my palm, that this story isn't over. That the chapter we witnessed was just the beginning. That someday, maybe tomorrow, maybe in 100 years, something will return to Devil's Hollow. Something will remember us. Something will come back. And when it does, we'll be ready. We'll be watching. We'll be waiting. Because once you've been marked by the stars, once you've had your mind touched by consciousness from another world, you never really stop watching the sky. You never really stop listening for that patient signal. You never really forget what it felt like to stand in the presence of something vast and ancient and fundamentally alien and feel recognized. The marks never fade. The memories never dim. And the story never really ends. It just waits, like we wait, like they wait, until the next chapter begins.